Tyranny of Steel. Chapters 178 to 194. Chapter 178 Escaping from Vienna. Weeks had passed since the siege of Vienna had begun, and the army of the Bavarians had already breached the city's gates. They were close to accomplishing what Lothar had failed to achieve during his life, and that was to capture the city of Vienna and overthrow the main Habsburg line. Duke Dietger smiled from afar as his battering rams smashed into the gates of the city's castle. Soon enough, he will be the reigning authority in Austria and unite the Austro-Bavarian kingdom. He would no longer be a mere duke but a proper king. At least that was his ambition in life, and he was close to seeing it to fruition. As the battering ram battered open the sturdy gates, the remaining defenders did their best to persist, but eventually, the gate fell. With it, an army of Bavarians charged into the castle seeking to claim it for themselves and round up the late Duke Wilmar's family so that they could be properly dealt with. The clash of steel resounded throughout the stale air of the castle's walls. Though Duke Dietger was not leading the charge against the invaders himself, the same could not be said for Gautbert, who bravely defended his family home until his last dying breath. The young duke, who had yet to be appropriately recognized for his title, courageously fought against a knight of Bavaria, as the two men wielded their swords with excellent skill in a fantastic display of medieval might. Surrounding them were the soldiers of both sides thrashing about in a grand melee, trying to gain the upper hand in the conflict. As their swords bound against one another, Gautbert unleashed a vicious backhand with his steel-clad fist, which smacked against the knight's pig-faced bassinet. Though the damage was not severe, it bought Gautbert enough time to redirect his blade into the gaps in the enemy's shoulder, which was not adequately protected by a rondel. As such, the knight staggered from the tempered high-carbon steel which found its way piercing through the mail armor, the gambeson beneath it, and finally his flesh. However, at this moment, Gautbert was struck by the attack of a nearby opponent, which merely glanced off of his mighty steel armor. Despite this, such a blow forced him to redirect his energy to defend against a second opponent. As such, the knight who had his shoulder pierced was allowed reprieve as another soldier took his place in the front line. Gautbert and his allies quickly found themselves on the back step, slowly receding into the hallway, while their numbers dwindled to the exceptional display of violence. While the Bavarians slowly made their way into the castle, the young boy Conrad was hiding in his room, scared witless from the ongoing events. His father had recently perished, and the city had fallen. His family's enemies had come to take their lives, and as a male of the family, his fate was sealed. Though his sisters might be spared and wed off to members of the von Wittelsbach family, he was a threat, and he knew with Duke Dietger's reputation he would for sure be destined to die. However, as the boy started to lose his mind to the sound of the echoing screams in the hall, he felt a hand grab a hold of him and drag him from his hiding spot. The boy was in no condition to observe his surroundings and quickly began to struggle as he struck the person who had grabbed a hold of him, screaming for his life. "No, I don't want to die. Please spare me." However, the result was not what he was expecting as he felt a dainty and feminine hand slap him across the face, which dragged him to his senses. In front of him, clasping onto his arm, was one of his maids, who went by the name of Elma. She stared at him fiercely, with a degree of determination in which he had not witnessed before. She quickly threw a set of peasant clothing to Conrad and ordered him in a stern voice. "Get dressed in these. Do it quickly if you want to live." Hearing there was hope for survival, the boy quickly stripped himself and got into the clothes. Despite the fact that there was a pretty woman in front of him after he was dressed in such clothing, Elma pulled a hood over his head and gave him further orders. "Come with me, S." She quickly dragged him away by the arm as the two absconded from the castle into a secret corridor that led into the city below. Conrad, of course, was greatly confused by the sudden changes in events and began to ask the questions on his mind. "Where are we going?" However, Elma merely glared at him and gave him further orders. "Don't ask questions, and stay silent." Conrad may have been an entitled brat and a fool, but he was at least capable of understanding the situation he was in at the moment, and as such, he nodded and obeyed Elma's orders. After the duo exited the secret tunnel, they entered the city below, where they began to act like a pair of peasants stuck in the city. As they slowly navigated the chaotic scene which displayed itself in the town, they were eventually stopped at the city's gates, where they were interrogated by the men-at-arms who were left to guard the city's entrances and make sure that nobody of significance escaped the town. Unlike Lothar's army, the Bavarians conducted themselves with some form of dignity. As such, They were not going around looting, raping, and burning the city to the ground, at least not yet. The guard on duty quickly halted. The duo soon noticed the team approaching the gate and bellowed his commands at them. Halt! Nobody is allowed to leave the city. You must return to your homes. Elma had already prepared an excuse beforehand and held onto forged identification papers to allow her access through the city's gates. As such, she quickly reached into her cloak and received a letter, which contained the seal of Count Siegmund of Bavaria. The letter notified that she was a spy set in place by the Bavarian count at the request of Duke Dietger, and she had urgent business to report to her liege. It appeared to have the proper mark of Count Siegmund, and as such, the guard accepted it as appropriate identification. He had no way of knowing that it was a counterfeit made by Berengar after his spies intercepted one of Count Siegmund's letters. They had largely replicated the Count's handwriting and seal through great effort, at least so much so that someone who was not overly familiar with such a thing would believe it. However, the guard was concerned about the young boy who was beside the woman claiming to be a spy, and as such, he quickly interrogated her about his identity. "Who is the boy? Why is he with you?" Elma looked over at Conrad with a glance that said, "Play along," before putting on a flirtatious smile and began to approach the guard in a seduction attempt. "Who this? This is just my slow little brother. He does not know how to speak. He was sent with me as part of my cover. He is not important. However, I would greatly appreciate it if you allowed us to pass. After all, my liege is expecting me. Since we are both in service to Duke Dietger to some extent, I am sure we will cross paths in the future, and when we do, I would owe you one." Elma was a relatively attractive woman in her late 20s, and as such, the man quickly bought into her charms before giving the order to his troops to let her pass. "Open the gates. These two work for Count Siegmund, they have proper authorization." After the gates were fully opened, allowing the duo to pass, Elma put on a sultry facade and kissed the man on his cheek, which was on full display from his open-face bassinet. "Until we meet again." With that said, Elma and Conrad escaped outside of the confines of the city, and when they were far enough away, they changed directions from the main road where they entered the nearby woods. Luckily for Elma, she had long since prepared an escape route, as were her orders from Lind, and she would be meeting with another agent of Berengar's Department of Intelligence, who would be waiting outside the city gates with a wagon to carry the group off to the borders of Kufstein. As such, Elma and Conrad quickly regrouped with the other agent of Berengar's vast spy network, where he was sitting on a wagon which was seated for two people. The back of the wagon was filled with straw, and Elma quickly gave Conrad another demand. "Hide in the straw, we will be safe when we get to our destination." However, at this moment, Conrad could no longer contain his curiosity and, of course, his concerns for his safety. As such, he ripped his hand away from the woman's grasp and began to shout at her. "Not until I get some information. For example, who are you people, and why are you helping me?" Elma sighed as she witnessed the fit in which Conrad was throwing. They did not have time for this, but she knew with the way Conrad was acting, he was liable to flee in the other direction and get himself killed if she did not tell the truth. As such, she quickly explained her reasoning for her actions. "We are going to Kufstein. Count Berengar has asked us to escort you to his realm so that you may be safe." Conrad was shocked by this news. He thought for sure he had thoroughly outraged Berengar at Adela's birthday celebration, and yet the man had gone through the trouble to escort him to safety. He was beginning to reevaluate the man who his father had praised so much in the past. Then again, his father was also wary of Berengar's rise to power and had frequently spoken about the man with caution in his voice. Conrad did not know how to act at this moment. However, another thought quickly appeared in his mind, and he could not help but ask, "What about my siblings?" Elma quickly shook her head as she urged Conrad to get into the back of the wagon and hide in the straw. "We don't have time for this. Quickly do what I say. The Duke could realize you are missing at every minute, and if he sends out a search for us, we will be caught. If you care about your own life, you will do as I say and get in the straw." Though Conrad was confused and slightly concerned about Berengar's objectives, ultimately, he was more concerned about his safety than that of his siblings and did what he was instructed, jumping into the back of the caravan where he hid in the straw. With that, the group escaped from the city of Vienna during the cover of darkness, entirely without Duke Dietger or his army realizing that the late Duke Wilmar's youngest son was missing. Chapter 179: The Fall of Vienna. As Conrad and Elma escaped into the night, Goutbert was currently fighting a losing battle, as he defied Duke Dietger's army with every fiber of his being. However, the longer he defended his family's castle, the more of his men fell to the meat grinder. As such corpses had begun to stack within the halls of the castle of Vienna, their blood flowing onto its cold stone floors. With every loss, Goutbert and his allies found themselves closer to the precipice. The young duke desperately swung at one of Dietger's knights with his longsword in his hands. However, he immediately felt a blunt object slam into the back of his helmet, which knocked him out cold. When he finally regained consciousness, he found himself sitting in the great hall, gathered together and bound among his siblings. Due to the impact on his skull, he did not initially realize that Conrad was missing from the group. Duke Dietger quickly entered the scene, and when he saw that Goutbert was bound and tied alongside his family, a wicked smile appeared on his face as he began to mock the man before him. "I must say your struggle was brave, yet foolish. You should have just surrendered your home and title to me the moment your father died in battle." Goutbert glared at Dietger with disgust. His only response to the man's provocation was spitting in his general direction, which caused a great sense of outrage to dwell within the Duke of Bavaria. In response to this insult, Dietger quickly snapped his fingers, and as he did so, one of his men-at-arms struck Goutbert with his steel-clad fist, knocking several of the young man's teeth loose. However, all that managed to accomplish was provoke a greater stare of enmity from Goutbert, who continued to defy Dietger. Thus Dietger once more tried to insult the young duke, who had only recently inherited his father's position. "You and your family belong to me. If you do not submit, I will exterminate the male line from your bloodline and marry your sisters off to my sons and grandsons. Your dynasty will forever perish from this world." Though Goutbert was at first resilient to Dietger's threats, when he heard that his family line would be extinguished forever, he grimaced as he began to contemplate his actions. Dietger was every bit as ruthless as the rumors had presented him. However, what came next was out of either of the two men's expectations. One of Dietger's knights approached the scene and proclaimed news that shocked not only Dietger but everyone present. "Your Grace, Wilmar's youngest son, has escaped the confines of the castle. We have no idea where he is at the moment." Hearing this piece of information, Goutbert grinned at Dietger with a mocking expression and began to taunt the man who had conquered his home. "Conrad must be long gone. You will never find him. Even if you execute me and those of my brothers who are present, you will never be the legitimate ruler of Austria so long as my youngest brother still draws breath. Go ahead and do your worst, but one day Austria will be independent and ruled by the Habsburgs once more." This insult stung Dietger like 1,000 wasps. As a result, the Duke of Bavaria furiously backhanded the bassinet of the knight who had informed him of such a thing. Of course, he was not wearing his gauntlets and nearly broke his hand from the impact, which put a painful expression on the man's face, thus causing Goutbert to laugh at the man's misery. Seeing Goutbert's mocking expression, Duke Dietger finally snapped and gave his men an order. Drag this bastard and his brothers out to the courtyard and behead them. As for Conrad, I want a search party sent out to find him. I fail to believe that he has escaped beyond the city's gates." Despite these orders, Goutbert showed no sign of dismay. Instead, he accepted his fate, knowing that there was still one heir left to his dynasty. Though the boy was a spoiled brat and still quite naive, he had plenty of years to grow into a great man, and as such, Goutbert died with a smile on his face, believing that Conrad would one day avenge him and their family. As for Dietger, he spent the remainder of the night searching every corner of the city for Conrad. However, when the dawn finally rose, he came to the realization that the boy was nowhere to be found in the city and had secretly escaped. Seeing that this was the case, Dietger flew into a fit of fury and demanded to find the culprit who had been lax on their duties and allowed such a vital pawn to escape the city unnoticed. Eventually, the guards who Elma had tricked were brought before Dietger bound and chained, where they were deeply confused about what they had done wrong. As such, Dietger made it abundantly clear as he asked them for the truth as to what had transpired several hours before. "Did you allow anyone to exit the gates you were entrusted to protect?" Not knowing the trouble he had caused, the man-at-arms who had given the order to open the gates quickly nodded his head and told the man of the information that he knew. One of Siegmund's spies requested to leave. She had a young boy in tow with her who she said was her little brother. Dietger immediately became suspicious of this news and inquired about it further. "This woman, how do you know she was one of Siegmund's spies?" The guard quickly coughed up the details of what had happened. "She bore a letter with his seal, which informed me of her identity. In the letter, it stated that she was acting under your orders." Dietger was so thoroughly enraged by this news that he could feel his brain was about to explode. As such, he forced himself to calm down. After a few death breaths, he ordered his knights to take care of the men who had failed their duties. Behead these men and place their heads on spikes so that all may remember the price of failing to fulfill their orders. As for Siegmund, I will take care of him when I get the chance. Dietger was already suspicious of Siegmund's loyalty, especially after his inactivity at the Tyrolean border and his constant request for reinforcements. He had already planned to punish the man for failing to fulfill his orders to advance into Tyrol. However, now it would appear that the man had schemed against him. This was simply intolerable. Thus Berengar had inadvertently shifted the blame for Conrad's escape onto the man who was currently besieging his borders. Though Berengar was crafty, he never expected Dietger actually to believe the excuse he came up with himself. With time being of the essence, Dietger quickly gave orders to several of his knights. Hunt down that bastard who has escaped and bring me his head. He is heading to Siegmund's territory. Go now. Dietger had given the orders to follow a trail that did not exist. As such, several of his knights would be sent on a wild goose chase in their attempts to track down Conrad and bring back his skull, thus allowing him and Berengar's agents to successfully exfiltrate back to Tyrol. When Dietger finally found out that Conrad had made it to the safety of the borders of Tyrol and into Berengar's clutches, he would lose his mind over the issue. However, for now, he suspected Siegmund was the culprit and was so enraged he could not even piece together who the real mastermind was. As for Conrad and the others, their wagon had successfully joined up with a trade caravan headed towards Kufstein's direction. After all, the area had become the center of trade within southern Germany, even during this time of widespread warfare. As such, they seamlessly blended in with the other merchants, who had no way of knowing they were harboring the target which the Duke of Bavaria and their armies were pursuing. Thus, Conrad, Elma, and the other agent were able to enjoy the journey to Kufstein peacefully. After all, any trade which intended to enter Berengar's lands was protected sufficiently with proper caravan guards, but also with the understanding that if they were to be attacked, Berengar would bring the full might of his army on anyone who was foolish enough to do such a thing. A fear that was burned into the minds of any would-be profiteers after the war with Kitzbühel. Thus Berengar's plans for the future were in full effect. With Conrad rescued and the remainder of the male line of the Habsburg dynasty executed, there was nothing to block his ascension as he fought for power within Austria. All that remained was to convince Conrad to name Berengar regent and retake the duchy with fire and fury, both of which Berengar was fully capable of accomplishing. Chapter 180 Visiting Graz I. As Conrad, Elma, and the other agent slowly made their way to Kufstein and the sanctuary it provided, Berengar was on his way to Graz, where he had planned to meet with his uncle and discuss his plans for the future. Albeit not to their fullest extent, after all, poisoning Conrad after assuming the position of regent was not exactly something he wanted to become public knowledge. However, Berengar also had a far more critical goal at the moment, and that was to meet with Adela. It had been many months since he was last able to see her cute little face, and he was beginning to wonder how much she had grown in this time. Thus, in all reality, the meeting with Otto was a cover so that he could spend some time with his cute little fiancée. For this meeting, he had left Lind behind in Kufstein. After all, he was pretty sure that Count Otto would disapprove of him bringing his lover and bastard son to the meeting. As Berengar and his caravan approached the city of Graz, they could tell that it had seen better days. Despite the fact that the city of Graz had not been besieged, the flames of war had ravaged many of the surrounding areas, which provided it with supplies, and as such, the people were struggling to feed themselves. When the city guards noticed the banners of House von Kufstein flying in the wind, they quickly went to inform their liege that Count Berengar of Tyrol had arrived. Of course, Count Otto was already aware that Berengar would be traveling to Kufstein. Berengar had made sure to inform him of his visit. As such, he was welcomed into the city with open arms. Before long, he and his caravan had reached the castle, where he stepped out of the carriage and greeted Count Otto at the footsteps of his castle. The man had an amiable smile on his face as he welcomed his nephew and future son-in-law. "Berengar, my boy, it is good to see you. How is your father doing?" Berengar smiled as he returned his uncle's greeting. "Though I have not had the time to visit my parents, I have received regular reports from the staff who tends to their needs, and they seem to be adjusting quite well to life in the countryside." Naturally, they are sufficiently protected from the potential invasion which tries to break into my lands as we speak." Quote, hearing this news, Count Otto and his wife Wanda smiled. It was good to hear that their relatives were doing well. As for Adela, she was standing in line with her other siblings, ready to greet Berengar. However, before she could do so, Ava stepped forward with a sultry smile on her face and began to analyze Berengar's appearance from head to toe. She was deeply filled with regret that she was not engaged to her cousin when they were younger. Though he was sickly in the past, he had grown into an exceptionally handsome man and was far more fit to be her husband. The moment the woman stepped forward, she embraced Berengar as if she had seen her long-lost lover. She made sure to press her ample bosom, which was even mightier than Linda's, into his chest. This was an act of provocation to mess with Adela's head. As she did so, the young woman cupped Berengar's face into her hands and gave her greeting to Berengar. "Dearest me, is that you, Berengar? You have grown so handsome over the years. I remember that you could not even stomach meat when you were so sickly. Surely times have changed." Berengar did not fall for her tricks. He quickly spotted the upset appearance on Adela's face and could guess Ava was using him to torment her little sister. Berengar promptly released himself from Ava's grip and hardly paid her any attention at all. After all, Ava's breasts may be larger than Linda's, but Linda's had a better shape and firmness. He could quickly tell such a thing just from having the woman press up against him. Instead, he merely accepted her greeting with a nod before pushing her aside to visit Adela. The act greatly infuriated Ava. She thought she could use her figure to seduce Berengar and thus cause Adela some mental anguish, yet it turned out the man had no interest in her. Was he a lolicon? Of course, she had no way of knowing that Berengar was not easily impressed by Ava's attempts after being with Lind for so long. After approaching Adela, Berengar wrapped his arms around the girl and openly declared his affection for her, which caused her face to flush in embarrassment. "My sweet little Adela, I have missed you so much." When Berengar hugged the girl, he made sure to check up on her development, and as such, he noticed that her chest had grown a bit larger from the last time he had seen her, which greatly pleased him, for he was not, in fact, a lolicon. Of course, he would not reveal such thoughts, nor his unscrupulous actions, and instead, he merely presented himself as someone who missed his fiancée a great deal. After latching onto Adela for quite some time, she nearly passed out from embarrassment before she was finally able to address the man she loved. Eventually, she found her voice, but she stuttered as she tried to present her jumbled thoughts. Me too." Ultimately she ended up muttering the phrase, and Berengar decided to tease his little fiancée by letting go of her and acting as if she had not heard what he said. In the process, he created some distance to allow her to state it clearly for everyone. "I'm sorry, I did not hear you. Could you repeat that?" Ava immediately noticed the mind games Berengar was playing with her little sister and found Berengar's character to complement her own, thus making her frown in jealousy. Adela struggled with the embarrassing situation she found herself in, and eventually, she just blurted out her thoughts. "I said I missed you too, okay." Afterward, she immediately began to pout, which caused Berengar to chuckle. Adela was just too cute when she was upset. Seeing the young couple getting along so well, Count Otto was incredibly pleased. It appeared as if Berengar still treated Adela well despite his infidelities. As for the Countess, she was even happier at the sight of Berengar and Adela's little dispute. To her it was a sign that they were meant for each other. However, she glared at Ava and her attempts to seduce Berengar. Even if it was meant only as a means to provoke Adela, the young woman had gone too far. Luckily Berengar had seen through her actions and merely chose not to entertain such illicit behavior. After saying their initial greetings, Count Otto made a suggestion. "Berengar, you must be weary from your journey. How about we all sit down at the table and discuss your journey over a feast?" Berengar smiled and nodded while holding Adela's hand before replying, "Lead the way." With that, the group of nobles entered the castle and approached the dining hall, where they sat down in their respective seats. Ava's husband Wolfgang had witnessed her overly affectionate display when she greeted Berengar. As such was not happy with her performance, yet he was too dull to realize that it was not an earnest seduction attempt, but just a means to irritate her little sister. As such, he did not say much during the initial portion of the meal. As for Berengar, he dined upon the delicacies which Adela had brought back the recipes from Kufstein. The chefs in this castle were every bit as talented as the ones in his own, and as such, he thoroughly enjoyed the meal presented to him. As for the beer, It was still the standard light beer brewed everywhere in Europe. It was not the grandiose Doppelbock or Oktoberfest beers in which he had brewed in his domain. However, it was enough to satisfy his thirst. While sitting at the table, enjoying his meal, Count Otto began to discuss with Berengar about his trip from Kufstein to Steiermark. After all, to get to the Count's territory, he had to pass through Bavarian-occupied territory. "So, how was your journey? I hope it was not exceptionally dangerous." Berengar shook his head as he dug into the beef rolladen sitting on his plate before answering the question. "Not exceptionally so. There was an attack on my caravan, but with the firepower I brought with me, the Bavarians were easily repelled. There's a reason I brought so many troops with me. It seems that Salzburg has completely fallen to the Bavarians, or at least to the degree that the roads and the forts between them are under Bavarian occupation. Whoever the count of that region is, has surely failed in his duties." Berengar was aware that Ava's husband was the Count of Salzburg and was actively taking a jab at him. In his opinion, it was utterly disgraceful for the man to stay hiding in Graz while his brother was left to fend for the region in which Wolfgang was responsible for. As such, Berengar was not afraid to insult the man directly to his face. As for Wolfgang, he was scowling at the remark. However, everyone else present at the table agreed with Berengar's statement, even if Wolfgang was too dull to realize it. Instead, the man lashed out at Berengar and used one of Ava's talking points that she had always used to scold Adela. "If your army is so capable, why have you not brought stability to all of Austria? Instead, you hide in Tyrol like a coward." Berengar smirked as he heard such a poorly thought-out response. He was more than happy to spar with this man verbally. Wolfgang was clearly out of his league. As such, Berengar responded in a condescending tone as if he was educating a moron about the art of war. "My troops are needed to protect my borders from constant invasion. Even though I am working overtime to draft new troops, these things take time. I can't just create an army out of thin air. Do not worry, boy. I will have won this war by the year's end." Berengar, being several years younger than Wolfgang, called him boy, which greatly outraged the man. However, Wolfgang could not think of a retort to such a well-thought-out statement. Instead, he merely gnashed his teeth and accepted his loss. Ava was outright disgusted with her husband's stupidity for fighting with Berengar in a war of words. After all, the man was well renowned for his quick wit. As for Adela, she was chuckling while sitting next to Berengar. The whole situation was funny to her. After this brief exchange of insults, the dust had settled, and Berengar was able to enjoy a fine meal with his fiancée. He would discuss his plans with Otto at a later date. As for Wolfgang, Berengar was more interested in conversing with his little brother about the matters at hand. The man in front of him was a dullard who would only screw up any job Berengar gave him. Thus the evening went by, and Berengar was content with his first night in Graz. Chapter 181, Visiting Graz 2. After dining with his in-laws, Berengar took a bath before entering the room he was provided. It was down the hall from Adela's and Ava's. However, he had no intention to visit either of them in the night. Adela was too young for his interest, and Ava, well, he did not desire her, though he was wary that the woman might pull something in his sleep. As such, he made sure to latch the doors and windows to his room thoroughly. One could never be too careful. If Berengar were in the modern era, he would probably search his room for bugs before resting, but this was the medieval world. Such sophisticated technology did not exist at this time. As such, he was able to sleep the night away without concern. By the time dawn rose, Berengar had naturally awakened. After all, his body was used to waking up at such an hour. Despite this, he was left with nothing to do as he had no major work concerns while he was in Graz, and most of his exercise equipment was at home. As such, he decided to do a small workout, where he did his usual routine of push-ups, sit-ups, and squats. As for his pull-ups, he would not be able to do such a thing as he lacked a proper pull-up bar. As such, he skipped it for the day and went on a run around the city, though he dressed as a peasant to avoid any trickery that might occur on his journey. After his journey was over, he returned to the castle where he intended to take a bath. However, the moment he opened the door to the bathroom, he noticed that there was a figure already inside the tub. Her massive chest was on full display as she scrubbed herself with soap. Her long blonde hair was wet, and slung over her delicate shoulders that appeared as if they were sculpted out of jade. Berengar immediately recognized the chest before him to be Ava's, and he stared at it for several seconds before coming to his senses. By the time he came back to reality, He saw that Ava's pretty face was flushed with embarrassment and her mouth agape. She looked like she was about to scream, and as such, Berengar quickly shut the door and hid behind it. Ava immediately sunk into her tub with embarrassment after Berengar shut the door. She had utterly forgotten to scream, and she did not realize that she had forgotten to latch the door. As such, she was struggling to cope with what had just happened. Berengar, on the other hand, briskly walked away as if nothing had happened, with a smile on his face. As he was doing so, he thought to himself, "That one is being saved to the memory banks." Afterward, he arrived in his room and waited until a time where he felt as if Ava would have left the tub, which was a safe 30 minutes. After waiting, he returned to the bath where he knocked on the door. When there was no sound, he entered, stripped, and began his bath. It was an exceptionally long bath as he vividly thought about the scene he had witnessed not long before. In times like this, he was glad he had a photographic memory. After getting out of the tub, Berengar returned to his room, where Ava was waiting for him, sitting on his bed, fully clothed and embarrassed. Berengar had no desire to do anything to her, and as such, he merely sat down in the chair across the room from her. He left the door open in case she tried anything. After sitting in the chair, Ava squirmed around for a few moments before she asked the question on his mind. "How much did you see?" Berengar played the part of an idiot and tried to dodge the awkward situation that presented itself. "Not much. The steam blocked my sight." "I suppose that's a good thing." Berengar's words stung Ava's pride as a woman. The way he communicated his last sentence made it sound as if he was not the least bit interested in her. As such, she began to pout before expressing her thoughts. "Why am I not good enough for you?" Berengar laughed when he heard this statement and made it clear where he stood on the issue. "You are my fiancé's sister and are already married with 3 kids. Sorry cousin, but I have no interest in your body. Maybe if you were a few years younger and still pure, but that ship sailed a long time ago. This awkward situation is entirely on you for not locking the door while you were bathing." Hearing Berengar's harsh words, Ava began to grind her teeth. Berengar had outright admitted she was used goods, and he had no interest in such a thing. Not only had he walked in on her bathing, but he also had the nerve to insult her afterward. She quickly realized that he was the worst kind of person. As such, she got up from her chair and walked towards the door before asking one more time. "You really did not see anything?" Berengar nodded his head with a blank expression. By now, he was a master at lying to women, and as such, Ava snubbed him before walking out the door, leaving behind the words, "Your loss." Berengar, of course, laughed the moment she was out of earshot. He had to admit Ava did have a great chest, but Linda's was better. Size was not everything when it came to judging such a topic. As such, he released a sigh and voiced his thoughts aloud. "I just dodged a bullet with that one." The last thing Berengar needed was to be entangled with another man's wife. Especially if she already had children. He may be susceptible to beautiful women, but he was not entirely brainless. As such, after calming himself down, he left his room and headed to the dining table, where he joined up with the others for breakfast. Sitting at the breakfast table was Count Otto, his wife Wanda, Ava, her husband, and her 3 children, as well as the remainder of Adela's siblings. Adela was also present and saved a seat for Berengar, which Berengar was more than happy to take advantage of. After sitting next to his little fiancée, Berengar tousled her hair as he greeted her. "How did you sleep last night?" Seeing the charming look on Berengar's face, Adela smiled and responded to his question. "I slept well enough." Berengar nodded his head in approval. It was only after he had said his greetings to Adela that he noticed Ava staring at him with a sense of overwhelming fury, which did not go unnoticed by the other people seated at the table. However, they chalked it up to Ava being pissy about how he snubbed her the day before. After all, she was pretty well known for being petty. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and Ava was exceptionally so. Not only did Berengar catch a glimpse of her naked body, which if she was honest with herself did not bother her so much when compared to the fact that Berengar once more treated her like her value as a woman was worthless. As such, she was furious with Berengar. She could not understand why he would react in such a way to her curvaceous body. As such, the atmosphere at the table was quite tense as Ava continued to stare at Berengar as if she wanted to set him ablaze with her mind. Berengar, on the other hand, was quite entertained by this, but he genuinely had no interest in Ava. As such, he spent his time at the dinner table pandering to Adela, which only further increased the wrath in Ava's heart. Berengar was talking to Adela and noticed she was wearing the colors of his house, with the jewelry he had provided to her for her birthday. "You look good in those colors, Adela." Though he was complimenting her, there was also a political statement behind his intent. However, Ava merely pouted. Though she had been able to get her hands on some of Berengar's fashion's designs, it was never as good as what Adela was able to get her hands on. The reason for this was simple. Berengar reserved the best clothing designs, made from the finest materials, for his two women. Everyone else had to get their hands on clothing and accessories that were still better than anything else on the market, but not quite the quality Berengar gifted to his women. As such, Ava continued to behave like a jaded lover to Berengar, and he ignored her. Wolfgang eventually caught on to the looks which she was giving Berengar and began to chastise his wife in a low enough voice that it could not be overheard by the others present at the table. "Quit glaring at him like that. You look as if he has stolen your innocence." Wolfgang knew that such a thing had never occurred, but it was still infuriating to see his wife gaze at another man with such passion, even if it was mostly fury. The only people who seemed to sense that something had happened between the two were the Count and Countess, who quickly made a mental note to find out just what had happened between Berengar and their eldest daughter. They may be willing to sell Adela to Berengar for a political alliance that benefited them. However, they would be damned if they would allow the young Count to do to Ava what he did to Lind. Of course, they had no idea that the reason Ava was so furious was that Berengar had rejected her advances. As such, the breakfast continued with a great deal of drama at the table, which Berengar would only be able to relieve himself from when it was finally finished. As for the meeting with Count Otto that would come later in the day. Chapter 182, Taking Advantage of a Crisis. After Berengar shared an awkward meal with his in-laws, he and Count Otto finally moved into the old Count's study, where they could communicate about the issues at hand. Count Otto was aware that Berengar was primarily here to see Adela, but officially the young Count was in Graz to discuss business. As such, the two men quickly got to the issues at hand, with Count Otto taking the lead. "So Count Berengar, tell me what is so important that you would cross a battlefield just to speak with me in person?" Berengar smiled at the way his uncle addressed him. In a formal setting such as this, referring to Berengar by his noble title was a way to show respect to his position. Berengar followed in a suit when he gave his reply. "Count Otto, I am here to address the ongoing crisis in the borders of Austria. By now the Bavarians have taken Vienna, and occupy large portions of Upper Austria, Lower Austria, Salzburg, and Kärnten. The only three counties left that are remotely intact are that of our regions and Vorarlberg. As such, I have come to request your assistance in resisting Bavarian tyranny." Count Otto narrowed his eyes at Berengar. He was not yet aware that Vienna had fallen, nor the consequences it had. After all, he did not have a spy in the Duke's court. Thus he was unaware of what had recently transpired. As such, he attempted to clarify his confusion. Since when did Vienna fall? Berengar was aware that his uncle was in the dark of the recent developments in the war for Austria. As such, he quickly informed the mighty Count of the information that he was privy to. "The castle of Vienna fell a few days ago. If everything has gone as planned, then my agents were able to smuggle out one of the late Duke Wilmar's heirs before the rest were executed, thus sparing the main Habsburg line from the brutality of Duke Dietger. When he arrives in Kufstein, I plan to establish a government in exile so that we may fully resist the oppression that Duke Dietger and his army of Bavarians bring forth." Count Otto noticed that Berengar was sure of the outcome, despite not providing any substantial evidence. Thus he questioned him further. "Do you have any evidence of these claims?" In response to this, Berniger merely chuckled before responding to his uncle's interrogation. He was confident enough in his spy network that they had succeeded in their endeavors. After all, he was traveling to Graz while they were at work rescuing Conrad from the Bavarians, so he had no way to know for certain if everything went according to plan. "Admittedly at the moment I am lacking in evidence, however, I am confident in the ability of my underlings. In the upcoming days, I am certain that my claims will become public knowledge. So until you can confirm my words for yourself, why don't we act as if they are the truth, and plan accordingly?" Though Count Otto was uncertain about whether or not Berengar's claims were true, the sheer confidence the young man had to make plans based on the assumption that everything had gone according to his desires was enough to convince Otto that the likelihood of such an outcome was high. As such he sighed in response to this news and voiced his innermost thoughts. "So my worst fears have become realized. Tell me, which of Wilmar's heirs did you rescue? Berengar smirked as he revealed the name of the heir that he had specifically chosen to save from the Bavarian's wrath. Conrad? Immediately Count Otto's face twisted as he heard those words. He was well aware that Conrad was by no means fit to rule the Duchy of Austria. As a wise man, he could already guess what Berengar was planning. As such, he immediately began to protest. You saved the youngest and least competent of Wilmar's heirs so that he can be your puppet while you possess the real power behind the throne? Berengar did not deny the charges. Instead, his lips curved into a sinister smile before he professed his guilt to the man who questioned him. I am afraid that I am, in fact, guilty of the charges you lay before me. However, let us be brutally honest with ourselves here. Do you genuinely believe that in the entire realm, there is anyone that is more fit to lead our duchy than myself during these darkest of days? Count Otto had a hard time believing that Berengar would outright admit to his schemes, but it appeared as if the young count was unafraid of the consequences in doing so. After all, he knew that his uncle would not reveal his plots, nor side against him. The two men were related by blood. They also shared a similar goal: to reunite Austria. If Otto opposed Berengar's wishes, he would create a civil war between the Austrian nobility who remained free from Bavarian occupation. In such an event were to occur, Otto knew that Berengar would ultimately be the victor and would likely succeed in his efforts to repel the Bavarian invaders. Either way, Berengar would install a puppet on the ducal throne of Austria and claim power for himself. Resisting such an inevitable outcome was an act of futility. Thus Count Otto sighed heavily before accepting the result. He recognized that by not seizing the opportunity to break the Bavarian siege of Vienna, he had played right into Berengar's hands, allowing the young man to usurp the power of the duchy for himself. Indeed, his nephew was an ambitious and cruel man. Nevertheless, by marrying his youngest daughter off to Berengar, Otto ensured that his dynasty would also rise alongside that of the von Kufsteins. As such, Otto had no plans to spoil his young nephew's endeavors. After agreeing with Berengar's schemes, he quickly asked the question on his mind. So, what is it that you need of me? Berengar once more grinned as he heard the result. The look in his eye was that of an evil mastermind who was pleased that his ambitions were progressing smoothly. Thus, he answered Otto's thoughts without delay. It is simple. I need you to endorse me openly. I fear that despite my stern warning, Conrad might still be a bit upset over the fact that I am engaged to the woman he fancies. What I need of you, the father of the said woman, is to help convince Conrad that I am the best choice for the position of regent. There is little doubt in my mind that he will try to select you to fulfill that role, even if it is out of spite. Count Otto nodded his head in agreement. Berengar's concerns were a likely outcome if left to their natural events. If that were the case, he would do his best to convince the spoiled brat that Berengar was the best man for the job. However, another worry instantly appeared in Otto's mind as he thought about Berengar's schemes. Thus he voiced his concerns. What about the Count of Vorarlberg? Surely he would be a potential candidate for the position. However, Berengar's reaction surprised Count Otto as the young man merely laughed at his worries before replying with an arrogant expression. Do not worry, the Count of Vorarlberg owes me a significant debt for sending troops to his aid. There is also the fact that so long as my armies are on his soil defending his lands, he will never oppose my wishes. The consequences of doing so would be dire, to say the least. Count Otto was not a foolish man. He immediately realized the threat that Berengar hid behind his words. If the Count of Vorarlberg were to vie for the position of regent, Berengar would turn his armies defending the borders of Vorarlberg to attacking its capital. The middle-aged count instantly realized that allowing Berengar's troops military access to his lands was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they were powerful enough to defeat any potential invading force and could be a great ally. However, in the very next minute, they could be enemies and deal far more damage to his lands than any other army in the world. After realizing this, Otto nodded his head in agreement and said no more. He would do as Berengar wished. After all, so long as Adela was set to marry Berengar, they would remain allies, and Berengar was a powerful ally to have. After thinking about Adela's position, Otto immediately remembered his concerns from breakfast. He quickly began to shift the subject so that he could find out the exact nature of Berengar's relationship with Eva. So now that we have that settled, I have a question I would like to ask you if you do not mind? Berengar was caught off guard by this and raised his eyebrows in response. Realizing it had nothing to do with his plans, his curiosity was piqued, and thus, he entertained Otto's questioning. "Go ahead. I have nothing to hide." After receiving his nephew's approval to interrogate, Otto quickly asked the question on his mind. "What exactly happened between you and Ava, for her to be behaving so strangely this morning while we were eating breakfast?" Berengar immediately broke out into laughter when he heard such a comment. Otto was not like his own father. He had a critical eye for social issues and quickly noticed something was amiss. However, the man was overthinking it. Because of such confusion, Berengar decided to clarify the issue before it turned into something serious. "Trust me, uncle, I am not interested in Ava. This is a misunderstanding. She forgot to lock the door to the bath, and I accidentally walked in on her. Of course, I immediately retreated when I saw such a thing. However, she later came to find me in my room and attempted to seduce me, where I thoroughly rejected her. She is in a poor mood because I implied I had no interest in a used woman." A giant scowl formed on Otto's face. If one looked closely, one could even see a vein appearing on his forehead. Though he was not angry for the reasons Berengar thought, it was only when the man revealed the reason for his fury in the form of a question did Berengar thoroughly understand why his uncle was so upset. She did what? Berengar had anticipated the man being enraged at him for walking in on his daughter while she was bathing, but instead, he was more concerned with his eldest daughter's actions. Thus Berengar decided to add fuel to the fire to punish Ava for acting so arrogantly. "She tried to seduce me. Honestly, I don't believe she has any interest in me personally. Instead, I think she is jealous of the relationship between Adela and myself and is simply trying to create drama. For a woman who is married and has 3 children, she acts like a child." After hearing this news, Otto sat down in the chair next to him. He needed a breather. Why was it that so many of his children were trying to vex him into an early grave? After taking a few deep breaths to calm himself down, Otto quickly replied to Berengar. "Thank you for being honest with me. I will take care of this matter so that she does not cause you or her sister any further insult." Afterward, the man walked out of the room in a fit of fury. Berengar merely grinned at the sight while thinking to himself, "You have brought this upon yourself, Ava. If you were not such a harlot trying to seduce your sister's fiancé, you would not be in such a position." Thus Berengar and Otto's meeting for future events had concluded. All that was left for Berengar's visit to Graz was to spend time with his darling little fiancé. Chapter 183. You are the perfect wife, did you know that? After finishing his meeting with Count Otto, Berengar found that he now had unlimited free time. As such, he quickly searched for Adela, where he intended to spend the day playing around with her. He rarely had as much free time as he did while on this diplomatic visit, thus, he intended to make the most of it. After crossing through the hallways looking for Adela, Berengar soon found himself face to face with Wolfgang, who did not have the most pleasant expression on his face. Instead, he stared at Berengar with an intense gaze of fury, as if his heart contained the fires of Tartarus in its depths. Berengar could tell by the look on his face that Ava had said something. As such, he met Wolfgang's furious gaze with a condescending smirk. Wolfgang, however, noticed Berengar's expression and immediately assumed it meant his guilt as he approached Berengar and tried to latch onto his collar. However, before he could do so, Berengar had grabbed a hold of the man's wrist and put him into a wristlock which forced the man onto his knees as he winced in pain. Though Berengar was by no means a seasoned grappler, he had gone through basic combative training in the army during his past life, and as such knew a few tricks he could use to subdue an opponent. As Berengar applied pressure to the lock that he firmly grasped onto, he began to chastise the man for his violent attempts. "You know, Wolfgang, it is not polite to assault your superiors for no reason. You should learn your place." On the other hand, Wolfgang verbally struck back at Berengar, especially over his claims of superiority. If anything, in Wolfgang's eyes, he was superior because he was born into the position of count, instead of being an upstart taking advantage of the crisis in the realm. "Superior? Don't make me laugh. You are nothing but a lowly baron who has risen through the ranks by profiting from the war which ravages our lands." Berengar's tongue was as sharp as always. If anything, the words he spoke next hurt the man who was struggling in his grasp far more from the pressure from the wristlock. "And yet, I am capable of defending my lands, where you hide in your wife's homeland, allowing your brother to fight your war for you. Now, why don't you tell me the reason that would cause a man in your position to attack me the moment you saw my charming face?" Wolfgang felt no desire to explain his rage to Berengar. a man he deemed to be a lecherous, amoral tyrant. Thus he responded with vulgarity. "Go fuck yourself." After hearing this stereotypical response, Berengar sighed before completing the wristlock, where he broke the man's wrist without any mercy. Berengar had learned his lesson about showing compassion to those who sought to do him harm. As such, he was ruthless with how he decided to handle the situation. After a loud cracking noise emanated through the cold stone hallway, followed by the wailing that sounded as if it came from a wounded pig, Berengar released the man and allowed him to wallow in his tears on the tile below. Berengar gazed coldly at the current Count of Salzburg before giving the man a warning. "I shall remember your attempt to do me harm on this day. When I finally liberate your lands from the Bavarians, I will make sure it is your brother and not you who is named Count of Salzburg. If you come at me again, you will find yourself buried 6 feet under, in an unmarked grave. Do not test me." With that brief exchange, Berengar walked away from the man who lay in the fetal position while clutching his broken wrist. Berengar thought nothing of his cruelty. After all, a man like Wolfgang was neither clever nor powerful enough to pose any harm to him. If anything, he had been lenient with his response to the man's violent actions. A broken wrist was by no means a severe injury and would heal itself in time. While Berengar exited the scene with confidence, the castle guards quickly responded to the sounds of Wolfgang's wailing and dragged him off to the court physician. Meanwhile, Berengar continued on his journey to locate Adela, and when he finally found the girl, he noticed she was wearing a white and golden gown while playing the harp. Dressed in such extravagant attire, with a serene expression affixed on her face as she closed her eyes and strung the chord of the harp, almost made Berengar believe that she was, in fact, an angel, not a human. Nevertheless, he knew such a thing could not be the case and nearly stood by and waited for the young teenage girl to finish her rendition of the song that she was currently playing. Adela was utterly unaware that Berengar had arrived and was leaning on a pillar listening to the sound of her music, and as such continued for a while before halting, where she released a short sigh of breath before opening her eyes and seeing her fiancé gazing at her with a smile filled with admiration and respect. The young petite beauty with golden hair and gemstone-like sapphire eyes quickly began to flush in embarrassment as she realized her fiancé had been listening to her the entire time. However, what came next shocked her. As Berengar slowly started to clap before escalating into full applause. The words that followed continued to add to her embarrassment. "I must confess I am rather embarrassed as your fiancé. To think that you had such talent in the art of music, and I was unaware for all this time. I must say I doubt even an angel in heaven could perform in such a manner." Adela could barely look at Berengar while in such a flustered state. Her cheeks were as red as roses as she heard his praise. It had been so long since she had last seen Berengar before he arrived in Graz that she was greatly concerned about him. Now seeing him with an eye patch, she realized that he had suffered in her absence while she stayed locked up in the Castle of Graz like some form of fairy tale princess. Thus Adela rose from her seat before slowly approaching Berengar. When she arrived before him, she reached up and wrapped her palms around his face while staring into his one good eye with a worried expression on her face. "You have suffered dearly during my absence, haven't you?" Berengar wanted to bluff his way through her statement, but in truth, life had become rather difficult since he lost the use of his right eye. As the young girl gazed at him with empathy and compassion, he finally lost control of his tough facade and smiled bitterly as a gloomy expression took hold of his scarred yet handsome visage. Doing so, he nodded, which confirmed to Adela her suspicions. Thus she hugged onto Berengar tightly in an attempt to cheer him up before gazing up at him with an adorable yet inquisitive gaze. "Can I see it?" Berengar instantly knew what she was referring to, and as such, he quickly released her grip before placing his hands on his eye patch and slowly lifting it off of his head. Though his right eye was closed, it eventually opened, revealing an intact but scarred eye. The ugly gash that had initially been there during the early days of the injury was replaced with a vertical scar that connected the gap between the scarred portions above and below his eye. Adela had held her breath throughout the slow reveal, but now that she was looking at Berengar's injury, she realized it was not as hideous as she had thought it would be. As such, she released her breath before attempting to cheer Berengar up by complimenting the look. "It is not ugly like I expected it to be. I think it gives your charming appearance the character of a battle-hardened veteran." Berengar chuckled bitterly in response to her words before revealing his innermost thoughts. "It is not the appearance that bothers me, it is how difficult it has become to function normally. I still can't ride to the forefront of the battlefield like I used to. Instead, I must allow my commanders to lead my troops into battle while I sit back from afar like a coward. Tell me, Adela, how can I be a great man who inspires men to follow him into battle if I am incapable of doing such a thing? Adela finally understood what had been eating at her fiancé this entire time. Berengar was the type of man to lead by example. At the moment, war was raging at his borders, but instead of leading the charge, he was sitting back in Kufstein eating luxurious food while drinking the best beer and wine. Despite this, his forces had to endure the onslaught of an enemy determined to bring down his realm. To Berengar, there was nothing worse in this era, where battles were primarily fought in close proximity than hiding far from the war zone, allowing your troops to fight in your stead. To him, it was the act of a coward, and as such, he had felt that he was cowardly in his actions. After overhearing Berengar's concerns about his current position, Adela put on a bright smile as she informed Berengar of what she genuinely thought about him. What makes you great is not only tied to your victories on the battlefield or how you lead your men into the fray. Rather, it is in large part due to the expense you have gone to ensure that your people benefit from your conquests and the wealth you gain. Adela took a brief pause to compile her thoughts and then continued her rant about Berengar and how she and many of his supporters viewed him. What you have done to Kufstein, what you are doing to Tyrol, and potentially one day even all of Austria is something no other man in this era can achieve. So you have suffered a minor setback. Did you not tell me that Alexander suffered multiple mortal wounds, and yet he always recovered to lead his troops into further glory? Eventually, she finished her speech with words of encouragement to Berengar, ones that he would forever remember inside the depths of his heart. You will recover from this, and when you do, all of your enemies shall remember the bravery and fortitude that you used to rally your troops to victory. Having heard Adela speak of him in such an honorable light, Berengar instantly felt like the weight that had been secretly hanging from his heart had finally released its hold over him. As such, he thanked Adela by hugging her tight into his embrace and kissing her on the forehead before complimenting her. You are the perfect wife, did you know that? This response immediately caused Adela to blush as she quickly glanced around to see if anyone was watching the romantic display. After realizing that nobody else was nearby, she finally relaxed and enjoyed the moment. Chapter 184. I shot myself in the foot there, didn't I? Unfortunately, the romantic moment between Adela and Berengar did not last long. Soon after it began, Ava came rushing into the room. She was practically steaming from the fury within her heart. If looks could kill, then Berengar would be a dead man. Seeing the deadly glare in her eyes, Berengar immediately began to smirk in the same condescending manner he had done to Wolfgang shortly before breaking his wrist. The young woman quickly ran up to Berengar and placed her finger in his chest before scolding him like a child who had gotten caught with his hand in the cookie jar. What did you do? Why did you break my husband's wrist? Berengar merely laughed at Ava while Adela gazed in confusion at the two. After taking his time to enjoy the moment, Berengar finally responded to Ava with a question of his own. What exactly did you tell your husband that would make him so enraged to the point where he deliberately searched for me so that he could assault me? Ava quickly realized what had transpired. She exaggerated the events from earlier in the morning to her husband, going so far as to accuse Berengar of picking the lock to her bath so that he could peep on her. Afterward, Wolfgang was thoroughly outraged by Berengar's alleged behavior and sought vengeance on behalf of his wife, which resulted in the current situation. However, before Ava could spin this event further in her favor, Berengar broke the silence and added a statement to his question. Next time, you should pick a better attack dog. Your husband is a worthless fool. Berengar grabbed a hold of Adela's hand and began to lead her into the corridor when Ava shouted out from a distance. You think you can peep on me in the bath, and there won't be consequences? I wonder what your fiancé thinks of your actions. Adela was quite startled by these accusations and looked at Berengar with cautious eyes. Though she wanted to believe he would not do such a thing, he had cheated on her with Lind in the past. She knew that her sister was an attractive young woman and could easily catch Berengar's glimpse. Seeing Adela staring at him in such a manner, Berengar's ire was thoroughly provoked by Ava. Rather than tolerate her words, and try to explain his actions civilly, he walked up to the woman and backhanded her across the face before responding to her accusations. Harlot, first, you try to seduce me, then when I reject your offer, you sick your hound on me. Now you slander my reputation. Because you are my cousin, I will be lenient, but this is your final warning. Come at me again, and I will make sure that you and your husband share the same unmarked grave. now get out of my sight." Ava was furious, not only at Berengar but also at Adela, who stared at her with a look of pity. After hearing Berengar's words, Adela was smart enough to piece together what happened. After all, she knew enough about both Berengar's and Ava's character to accurately guess what had transpired to cause all of this drama. She would not be surprised if her sister Ava had purposely left her bath unlocked so that Berengar might stumble into it. Ava was rubbing her cheek, which was now red from the strike she had received from Berengar. She had never been treated in such a manner before, and as such, she did not know how to react. On the one hand, she wanted to skin Berengar alive. However, the more rational part of her brain told her that was simply impossible. Her husband was neither clever enough nor powerful enough to harm the young Count of Tyrol. Thus her actions revolved around fleeing the scene with tears in her eyes and complaining to her father. However, Ava was utterly unaware that her father was already mindful of her attempts to cook up drama needlessly, and as such, was already intending to give her a thorough scolding. After Ava fled the scene, Adela began to pout at Berengar, and when he turned around to look at her, he noticed he was not entirely off the hook yet. Before he could protest his innocence, Adela caught him off guard with a question. "Peeping on my sister while she is in the bath, huh?" Berengar instantly felt awkward from the accusation and attempted to defend himself. "In my defense, she left the door unlocked. I merely entered the bath after realizing it was unlocked. How was I supposed to know she was bathing inside?" On the other hand, Adela was more curious about how much he had seen and thus inquired about it. "How much did you see?" Berengar decided the best course of action was to tell a half-truth. Obviously, he could not allow the girl to know that he found her sister attractive, but if she later found out that he lied to her about seeing her half-naked, she would surely be outraged. "Only her bare chest. However, it was not nearly as magnificent as Linda's, and as such, I was not tempted by it." Adela reacted in a way that Berengar had not expected. The young girl was trembling with anger when she realized that Berengar's first instinct was to compare her sister's chest with Linda's. Not only that, but he had the nerve to brag about Linda's chest being superior. Did that not mean that when Adela herself finally grew into her full figure that she too would not be as good as Lind? Thus Adela instantly shouted at her fiancé before storming off to her quarters. "Berengar, you big dummy." It took Berengar a few moments to realize his mistake before he caught on to exactly what had angered the little girl. After it finally registered in his brain, he placed his palm on his forehead and sighed heavily as he spoke to himself alone in the room which contained the harp. "I shot myself in the foot there, didn't I?" While Adela was off pouting alone in her room, Ava complained to her father about Berengar's alleged misdeeds. "Daddy, he peeped on me in the bath, and when my husband confronted him, the scoundrel had the nerve to break his wrist. Do something about this." Ultimately, Ava felt like she could get what she wanted by exploiting the drama she had created, and that was to break Berengar's and Adela's betrothal. After all, she was incredibly jealous that her youngest sister was engaged to Berengar, considering he was so much more accomplished than her husband. It filled her with fury to know that Adela had snagged a better man than her. However, Otto was not an idiot. He knew his children's personalities, and Ava was among the worst he had raised, a spoiled brat of low cunning who needlessly caused drama to entertain herself. Thus he stared at her with a stoic expression as he voiced his discontent. "Cut the crap, Ava. Do you honestly expect me to believe Berengar is the one at fault here? Since you have returned to this castle with that idiot husband of yours and your 3 children, you have done nothing but stir up trouble with Adela. I have permitted your childish tirades long enough. For Christ's sake, you are a countess and a mother. Think of your position before you go around trying to seduce your sister's fiancé." Ava was stunned. Berengar had gotten to her father first and had told his side of the story, which was essentially the truth of the matter. She began to pout at her father and plead with him. "Daddy, please." However, the Count shook his head before reprimanding his daughter once more. "Do you have any idea who you decided to provoke? Berengar is a vicious and cruel man to those who seek to do him harm. Do you have the slightest clue about what happened to Lambert after the boy crossed him?" Ava quickly crossed her arms and said in an undeserved smug voice. "He initially sent the boy to the Teutonic Order, where he returned with an army and was killed in battle." Otto stood up from his seat and crowded his daughter in the act of intimidation before telling her the truth of the matter. That is the official story. However, what you probably have not heard is that after Berengar personally killed his little brother in the heat of battle, He had Lambert's skull removed and turned into a golden chalice which he uses to drink from every day. A look of horror spread across Ava's face as she heard the message. The German people had not engaged in such barbarism since the Dark Ages. Yet, Berengar had resurrected such a savage tradition, and with his brother as the victim. Only now did the young woman begin to comprehend the monster whose tail she had stepped on. Seeing her daughter suddenly realizing his intent, Otto continued on his efforts to frighten her out of messing with Berengar in the future. "Tell me, Ava, if the man is willing to engage in such savage cruelty to his brother, what do you think he will do to his cousin and her idiot of a husband? That man will one day be the Duke of Austria. Is riling up your little sister worth making such a monumental enemy?" Ava was instantly reminded of Berengar's parting threat and felt a shiver down her spine, forcing her to sit down in the chair next to her as she thoroughly contemplated her actions. It was only then she realized the end of her father's sentence. "What do you mean he will be the Duke?" Count Otto merely shook his head and informed his daughter slightly of the ongoing political battle in Austria. "Duke Wilmar is dead, and so are his living heirs. Vienna has fallen. Berengar has already made a ploy to claim the title of Duke after he drives the Bavarians from our lands, and make no mistake, he has the power to do so. You should apologize to Berengar and your sister before an irreconcilable grudge is formed." Realizing the grave mistake she had made, Ava quickly became covered in a cold sweat and silently made a vow in her heart that even if she had to sell her body to Berengar to repair their relationship, she would resolve this conflict no matter what the cost. Of course, Berengar had no plans for such a thing. Now that he had two loyal women by his side, he did not need a third. He had always said 2 women was the perfect number for a man to have. The only way he would entertain the idea for a third was if it meant forming a critical alliance with a powerful nation. Instead, it would take some time for him to find a way to exploit Ava and her husband's apology in a way that benefited his interests. Chapter 185 Sweet Dreams. After the drama that unfolded during his stay at Graz, Berengar found himself in an awkward position. Adela was not speaking to him at the moment due to several complicated reasons that Berengar was too dull in social matters to properly comprehend. As Berengar was thinking over this problem he had no way out of, he heard a knock on his door. As such, he cautiously opened the door and peered out from the crack in it. In the doorway was Adela, who was still dressed in her white and gold attire from earlier. She had a pouting look on her face, though it no longer contained the fury of a woman scorned, and as such, Berengar relaxed his guard a little while opening the door slowly. As soon as the door opened most slightly, Adela pushed her way into the room and sat down on the bed with her arms crossed and her cheeks puffed out. After a long and awkward silence, Berengar was the first to broach the subject. He decided to bite the bullet and apologize. "I am sorry if I offended you. I should not have mentioned Linda's figure when defending my actions." Berengar stared at Adela for a few moments with a puppy dog look in his eyes before the young girl finally spoke. "Do you honestly think I am mad about the fact that you mentioned Linda's near-perfect body?" Berengar looked at Adela with confusion. He had no idea why she was upset if it was not because he mentioned her rival. However, those were not the words that came out of his mouth. Instead, he merely questioned her phrasing. "Near perfect?" This immediately caused Adela to pout again, and she quickly scolded Berengar. "Don't push it." Seeing her mood quickly sour, Berengar decided it would be best to shut his trap and thus took his scolding from his future wife as a man. Adela, of course, was more than happy to do so. As such, she started her lecture by asking Berengar a simple question that he did not expect. "Berengar, you don't have the slightest clue why I am angry, do you?" Berengar shook his head. At this point, it was better to be honest with his fiancée, and so he acted accordingly. Seeing his reaction, Adela sighed before loosening her posture and collapsing on the bed, where she sprawled out on it before expressing her long and complex thought process. "At first I was angry because you said you were completely untempted by Ava's body because Linda's body was better. I had time to think about why that was, and I eventually concluded that I was worried about the future. When I finally grow into my full figure, which is most likely going to turn out like the rest of the women in our family, that you would not be interested in me in the slightest, because you have Lind." Berengar listened to Adela's complaints closely and realized that this was a concern that he never even considered to be a possibility. However, before he could address her worries, she sat up from the bed and crossed her legs while resting her cut doll-like face on her hand, where she proceeded to glare menacingly at Berengar. Immediately her tone shifted from understanding to wrathful, which caused the hair on Berengar's neck to spike up. Then I realized that such a thing was simply impossible. Though Linda's body is perfectly proportioned, so are many of the women in our family. Ava used to have an even better body than she has now before she had her 3 kids, so clearly, it was not that you found her unattractive, as I know you like a full-figured woman. When I realized that, I knew that you lied to me because you were afraid to tell me the truth, that my sister's body aroused you. I'm right, aren't I? A 13-year-old girl was lecturing Berengar about finding her elder sister attractive. Adela of course was right on the money. Berengar lied to her to defend his actions. As such, he was sitting on his knees with his head bent like a small child being lectured by his mother for starting a fire in the living room. After Berengar's silence filled the room, Adela snapped at him. Well, aren't I? Berengar quickly nodded his head in affirmation without saying a word, which Adela found to be unbefitting of the infamous Tyrant of Steel, so much so that she laughed before making fun of him. Why are you so afraid? It is not like I'm going to have you beheaded. Berengar, of course, took a few moments to collect his thoughts before he let out a defeated sigh. After screwing up with Lind, I feel like I have been walking on thin ice around you, as if I am one more mistake away from you leaving me, and I am terrified of such a thing. So I lied about finding your sister attractive because I felt if you found out the truth, you would think I am a lecherous fool and abandon me. After hearing Berengar tell her the truth about how he felt, which is all she ever longed for, tears began to form in Adela's eyes. She had no idea that he felt like he was walking on eggshells the entire time he was around her, and such words pulled on her heartstrings. Adela got down from the bed and kneeled next to Berengar, which alerted him, however, in the next moment, before he could react. The teenage girl grabbed a hold of his head and stuffed it in her lap. After doing so, she looked away from Berengar, trying not to show off how embarrassed she was. Where she muttered in a low voice that was just loud enough for Berengar to hear correctly. Dummy, I would never leave you. Berengar fought to prevent a smile from appearing on his face, but it was a losing battle. As an avid fan of anime and manga in his previous life, he had always desired the fabled lap pillow. But even after living 2 lives, he had yet to have such a thing occur to him until now. While Berengar rested his head in Adela's lap, she began to stroke his silky golden hair, completely undeterred by the grease that coated her fingers as she did so. The two sat like that for some time, to the point where Berengar nearly fell asleep. Unfortunately, the endearing scene came to an end when another knock appeared on the door. The familiar voice behind the door belonged to Ava, who had come to make amends with Berengar. Berengar, are you in there? I have come to apologize for my actions. Both Berengar and Adela were scowling the moment they realized who the knock belonged to. This little vixen had caused so much trouble between the two of them in such a short time, and here she was ruining their reunion. However, Berengar decided to get up from his relaxed position and head for the door, where he opened it, much to the chagrin of Adela, who pouted where she was kneeling. After opening the door, he was scowling at Ava, which immediately frightened her, especially after the conversation she had with her father. However, Ava swallowed her pride and immediately bowed her head in reverence before apologizing. I am truly sorry for what I did. I hope that you can forgive my husband and me for our actions. Berengar merely scoffed at her reaction. She picked a horrible time to apologize. All she managed to do was torment him further by interrupting his heavenly lap pillow. At this moment, Ava noticed Adela was in his room, and she recognized that she might have been interrupting something important. Especially when she considered the way the two looked at her. However, she was already here and had spoiled the mood, so she might as well get this over with. As such, Berengar looked at her indifferently before sighing heavily. Whatever, we are family, so I will let it slide just this once, but you and your husband owe me for being so benevolent. Hearing Berengar's command instantly sent shivers down Ava's spine as she recollected herself before nodding in agreement to Berengar. Sure, whatever we can do to help, we will gladly repay this favor. After agreeing, Berengar shooed the woman away. He no longer wanted to be around her. If that is all, leave us. Seeing that Adela was giving her a deathly glare, and Berengar was no different, Ava quickly bowed before running off into the distance. After doing so, Berengar shut the door and returned to Adela, where he had a smile on his face, before asking Adela the question on his mind. Now, where were we? Upon witnessing the grin on Berengar's face, Adela's cheeks flushed in embarrassment before she muttered. Just this once. Seeing that the girl had accepted, Berengar immediately hopped back into the lap pillow, where he quickly fell asleep. After dozing off, Adela merely stared down at his sleeping face lovingly before kissing him on the forehead. Sweet dreams. Chapter 186. An important announcement during a lovely dinner. Several hours had passed, and Berengar awoke to the soft sensation of the silk dress that covered Adela's thighs. Even she had fallen asleep during this time as he rested in her lap pillow. However, it was merely a power nap and not an actual night's rest. As such, Berengar continued to enjoy himself until the moment his fiancée awoke from her slumber. After a few moments, Adela quietly opened her eyes, where Berengar pretended to be still asleep, realizing that it was nearing time for dinner. Adela began to pet her future husband's golden hair with a smile on her face. "Wake up, sleepyhead, it is almost time for dinner." Being already awake, Berengar was smiling at the loving gesture of Adela before he pretended to wake up slowly. He honestly wished he could enjoy this moment a little longer. However, all good things must come to an end. Thus Berengar rose from the lap pillow and rubbed his eyes. "How long was I out for?" Adela, who was also asleep, shook her head as she revealed what she knew. "I don't know, I also fell asleep, but it must have been a few hours. Look at the sun, it has already begun to set." Berengar and Adela immediately shifted their view towards the window, which revealed a beautiful sky filled with fluffy clouds. It appeared to be the perfect blend of orange and blue. The sight of which instantly spurred feelings of romance in every couple who stared at its brilliance together. Berengar and Adela were no exception. However, they could not enjoy its beauty for long. Shortly after, they heard a knock at the door, followed by one of the servants announcing that the time for dinner had arrived. "Berengar, it is dinner time. Count Otto has requested your presence." Hearing such news, Berengar got up from his position on the ground and offered a helping hand to Adela. The adolescent girl quickly latched onto it, where Berengar dragged the girl from her knees and into his arms before petting her on the head. "I suppose it is time to eat." Adela stuffed her head into Berengar's chest before muttering in a low voice. "Yeah." Afterward, Berengar opened the door, and the servant was already gone. As such, he and Adela inched towards the dining hall while holding hands. When they finally arrived, they realized that they were the last to do so, and as such, quickly sat down in their seats so that the meal no longer waited upon them. After being brought the dishes for the night, the group said the Lord's Prayer before dining into their meals. Otto was aware of the trouble that Ava had caused, but he was not yet aware that she had adequately apologized. As for Wolfgang, he glared menacingly at Berengar, and yet Berengar paid no heed to his malicious gaze. Ava was quite worried. Even though Berengar had claimed he accepted her apology, she had no idea what kind of favor he may ask of her in the future. Because of her fear of the unknown, she seldom looked towards Berengar and Adela's direction. As for Berengar and Adela, they were smiling happily, like a loving couple on their honeymoon. They had squashed their relationship problems before they turned into something serious, and as such, were in exceptionally high spirits on this fine evening. The Countess noticed Adela's good mood and quickly commented on it, with a charming smile on her face. "You two seem to be unusually happy this evening. Did something happen between you two?" Count Otto was also quite curious. As far as he was aware earlier in the day, Ava had seemed to cause a severe rift between the young couple, but now they were chatting and giggling like a couple of teenage brats who were in love for the first time in their lives. Well, he supposed for Adela that was most certainly the case. Berengar, on the other hand, not so much. Most curious of all was the eldest son and heir of Count Otto, Gerhard, who had since Berengar's arrival gone out of his way to avoid the man. After all, he had caused quite the controversy when he tried to break Berengar and Adela's betrothal, so much so that he was no longer on speaking terms with his youngest sister. Ultimately, Adela was the one who spoke up about her current state of affection for her future husband. "You could say Berengar and I have come to an understanding." The teenage girl knew how to leave things cryptic. It was a great way to infuriate Gerhard and Ava. She was not above causing some trouble of her own, which caused Count Otto to frown. He knew Adela was now striking back at her siblings. However, he did not blame her for doing so. After all, she had previously been put in a difficult position by the two of them. Gerhard scowled when he heard this. He still did not approve of his lecherous and cruel cousin grooming his lovely little sister. However, it was not his decision to make, and his father had already made that abundantly clear. As for Adela's other brother, Hymeric, he was smiling at the whole affair. He greatly admired Berengar's accomplishments and supported creating a long-lasting relationship with his cousin, especially since he knew of Berengar's reforms, and was hoping that when the young man became duke, he would allow noble houses to implement such succession laws if they so wished, which would enable him to contend for the succession of his father, with his foolish brother Gerhard. Thus Hymeric was the first to comment on Adela's statement. "Whatever it is, I am glad to see you two getting along so well. I wish the two of you great happiness in your future." Gerhard and Ava snarled at this response, but Count Otto and his wife Wanda were pleased by Hymeric's comments. The boy looked more and more like successor material. It was just a shame that he was the second son instead of the first. Hymeric was not as cruel as Lambert and would never make an attempt on his brother's life, but he would undoubtedly do his best to usurp his position in any other way. Berengar was smiling as he dug into his meal, with a smile on his charming face. He was incredibly pleased that he could enjoy such a level of cooking, even across the duchy. His cultural changes were beginning to affect more than just Tyrol. After washing it down with some light beer, he decided to make an announcement. As such, he gathered everyone's attention by clanging his spoon on his chalice. After everyone gazed over at him, Berengar smiled gracefully before letting everyone know his decision. "I have decided to announce it here, but I will be departing tomorrow morning, back to Tyrol. Though I am incredibly thankful for the hospitality you have shown me and the time that I have spent with you all. I have many important matters to attend to, and unfortunately, I can't dwell here any longer. I just wanted to thank you all for allowing me to stay here these past few days." When Adela heard this, she began to pout. After all, she and Berengar had just settled their differences and were starting to spend time together. However, she understood Berengar had many matters to oversee, and as such, she could not monopolize him. As for Count Otto, he was aware of the plans Berengar had in place. In a few days, Conrad would be arriving in Kufstein, and Berengar needed to be there to greet the boy and cement his power. After Berengar made an announcement, Otto made one of his own. "I will also be traveling with Berengar to Kufstein. There is a matter of great importance that he and I must attend to. Adela, if you would like to come with us, you may. As for who is in charge during my absence, I will pass that responsibility to Gerhard. Do not disappoint me like last time." The expressions around the table varied greatly. Adela was pleased, as she not only got to spend more time with Berengar, but she could finally see his baby boy with her own eyes. Despite herself not being the mother, she felt a great desire to see what his offspring would look like and to get close to him early on. As for Gerhard, he was exceptionally thrilled that he was being given another chance. He had thoroughly screwed up his last stint as regent, so much that his position was stripped and given to Hymeric during the remaining duration. Hymeric on the other hand was scowling. He was confident that he would be left in command the next time his father departed for an extended period. Yet, the position was given to his elder brother once more. He supposed he would be the one tasked with leading the armies, which was fair. After all, he was far more capable in that regard than Gerhard. Ava and her husband were glad that Berengar would be departing. His presence was a constant reminder of his tyranny and the ever-increasing fear they felt for their actions. Ava had informed Wolfgang not to annoy further Berengar and the reasons for doing so. He may be dull, but he was also a coward and knew when to fear the mighty. Ultimately Berengar smiled at this result. Not only would he be able to spend more time with Adela, but Otto was personally visiting Kufstein to greet Conrad and form the resistance against the Bavarian occupation of Austria. 3 counts would meet in Kufstein where they would convince Conrad to declare Berengar as regent, then he would possess all the authority of a duke. First, he would drive the Bavarians from Austria, then, he would implement his reforms across the entire duchy while building a great navy. After all, with all of Austria under his command, he would finally have access to the Adriatic Sea, and by extension the Mediterranean. Once this goal was achieved, Berengar could finally send expeditions to the New World. Soon enough, his life's goal of gaining potatoes would become a reality. Chapter 187 Returning to Kufstein. The evening came and went, and Berengar ultimately returned to the room provided for him where he retired for the night. After sleeping well, he awoke early in the morning and began making preparations for the journey to Kufstein. It was not long before he was standing outside the castle in its courtyard, waiting for Adela and Otto to arrive. Eventually, Adela and Otto presented themselves, where they greeted Berengar. They had already said their farewells to their family, as it would be a while before they returned. Otto was the first to voice his concerns over the journey. Berengar, are you certain that we will be safe traveling through Salzburg and into Kufstein? Hearing Otto voice his worries, Berengar nearly chuckled. He had with him a sufficient amount of cuirassiers and mounted infantry who he had explicitly raised to guard his caravan. He had been spending an enormous expense lately purchasing as many warhorses as possible from various parts of Europe. While his cavalry was made up of primarily cuirassiers and lancers, he still made efforts to raise mounted infantry for rapid excursions or protecting him during his travels. Thus at present, his forces were sufficient to pierce through the county of Salzburg with little effort. As such, Berengar informed Count Otto of his certainty. Do not worry, uncle, my cuirassiers and mounted infantry are more than enough to defeat any force that is foolish enough to attack us on our route to Kufstein. We will be perfectly safe. Hearing Berengar's confidence on the issue greatly dissuaded his concerns, and such he nodded his head in agreement. I hope you are right. With that said, Count Otto was the first to step into the carriage that Berengar had provided. After her father had done so, Adela approached Berengar and wrapped her arms around his neck before pecking him on the cheek. It had been so long since she had been in Kufstein, and she was filled with anticipation. She had dreamed of revisiting, ever since she read the letters of Berengar's construction efforts. After kissing Berengar on the cheek, the teenage girl blushed before grabbing onto his hand. Shall we go? Berengar smiled and nodded before dragging his future wife into the carriage, where he then gave the order to depart. Thus the caravan of armed guards and Berengar's host were effectively on the march as they began to leave the city of Graz. At an average speed of 15 miles per hour, it would take the caravan roughly 14 hours to reach their destination. During this time, Adela and Berengar flirted for the most part, which made Count Otto deeply uncomfortable. After a little over 14 hours had passed, Berengar and his caravan arrived at the borders of the city of Kufstein. Their journey was uneventful, as the Bavarians occupying Salzburg had already learned their lesson from the last time they targeted Berengar's caravan and thus kept their distance in fear of once more sustaining massive casualties. Seeing the great walls of the city of Kufstein in the distance, Adela peeked her head out the window with awe. Such marvelous structures did not exist during her last visit to the region. She had read in great detail about Berengar's infrastructure projects from his letters. Still, upon witnessing them with her own eyes, she felt as if even the legendary Theodosian walls of Constantinople could not compare. Even Count Otto stared with amazement at the grand structures. He was specifically drawn to the gray bricks used in their construction and inquired about their composition. Berengar, just what exactly are these walls made out of? Berengar had an arrogant smile on his face as he described the materials the walls were constructed with while exuding an overwhelming aura of pride. Well, for starters, we take cinder blocks, which are semi-hollow bricks made out of concrete. From there, we fill the gaps with structural steel reinforcing bars or rebar for short. Then after the cinder blocks are properly reinforced, we pour more cement inside the gaps to seal them shut and secure the rebar within. The steel-reinforced bricks are then stacked together until the proper thickness of the walls is achieved. This is just a summary of how we build such structures. In reality, it is far more complex. However, as you can see, the walls are shorter and far thicker than ordinary castle walls. This is to maintain structural integrity if my enemies were to bring cannon fire onto my city. Something that traditional walls have proven to be weak against during my campaigns. Count Otto was trying to register everything that Berengar had said while gazing in awe at the fortifications surrounding Kufstein's city. He quickly realized anyone who decided to launch an attack on such a well-defended city was merely asking for their death. Soon enough, the caravan entered the city gates, which opened upon seeing the banners of House von Kufstein flying above the approaching caravan. With it, Berengar and his guests entered into a city the likes they had never seen before. While the outer areas closest to the walls were currently unoccupied, the closer they approached the center, the more they saw magnificent tenements and houses constructed in the half-timber style. There was no sign of filth in the streets as each building had its internal plumbing, which flowed to a sewage treatment plant outside of the city, then pumped into the nearby river Inn. However, what captured Adela's sight were the massive projects that were either undergoing construction or already completed, such as the Grand Cathedral, the Grand Palace, and the parliamentary buildings. These buildings were all made in a unique architectural style that had yet to enter this world. They were beautiful compared to the other structures of the era and easily caught Adela's interest. It had been over half a year since she was last in Kufstein, and yet it had changed so much. It was genuinely unfathomable how quickly Berengar had built his city. Still, he relied on a large workforce and the advanced technologies of structural steel and concrete to build the city so rapidly. Even the gorgeous half-timbered tenements and homes were built using concrete instead of more traditional materials, especially for their foundations. Of course, the concrete was covered in stucco to make it more aesthetically pleasing. Thus, the buildings hardly looked any different from the more traditional buildings built in such a style across Germany. It was only after entering the city square where Adela saw the monument dedicated to Berengar overlooking the city from the hill above it. She could not help but gasp as she saw the massive bronze statue of her fiancé on horseback, fully dressed in armor and raising his sword in the air. Berengar saw the adorable expression on her face and immediately asked her the question on his mind. Magnificent, isn't it? Adela was so shocked at the level of craftsmanship that she had no words and merely nodded with her mouth agape. Seeing Adela's reaction, he was more than happy with the expense he had paid for such a thing. On the other hand, Count Otto was deeply envious of the city Berengar had created. It appeared to be a fitting place for the capital of an empire. He had no words for how much he desired Graz to be rebuilt in such a fashion. In the end, he could only sigh in defeat. Berengar's wealth and knowledge were too much for an older man like him to compete with. After traversing through the city, they finally crossed the river and ended up in the castle courtyard where Lind and Henrietta were waiting for his arrival. Henrietta was holding Hans in her arms, which Berengar instantly realized the reason when he saw it. As such, he stepped out of the carriage intending to inform Lind to behave herself in the presence of Adela and her father, but he was a moment too slow. Before he could even get off the steps, Lind had jumped into his arms and kissed him passionately, forcing her tongue through his lips, while hanging her arms his neck. She used her natural assets to press into Berengar's chest and tried to suck the air out of his lungs. Only when Adela and Count Otto followed Berengar out of the carriage did Lind realize she had made a mistake. The way Adela glared at her instantly sent shivers down her spine, and thus she quickly released her hold over Berengar before turning away in embarrassment. On the other hand, Otto was observing his daughter's reaction to Berengar openly displaying his affection for another woman. Despite the fact that Adela had said she was okay with it, she had never personally witnessed her fiancé be intimate with another woman. Surprisingly, she handled it quite well. It was only after Lind recovered her senses did she properly greet Berengar. "I missed you so much, darling." Adela's brow instantly raised as she heard the pet name that Lind used when referring to Berengar. Of course, if Lind were in private with Berengar, she would use the term master when addressing her lover, but she commonly referred to him as dear or darling in public. Hearing the two were so familiar, Adela began to pout. Lind noticed this and quickly shifted her attention to Adela, who greeted her in a friendly manner. "It has been a long time, little Adela. I look forward to your stay. We have much to talk about." Though they had been corresponding with letters to one another, the two had not had a proper discussion on how to divide Berengar's attention face to face, and thus they would need to negotiate appropriately as such. Adela put on a smile and nodded at Linda's statement. "We sure do." Berengar could tell the situation was tense and, as such, tried to lighten the mood. "We can talk about these things further when we are inside." Before his daughter could break out into a fight with Lind over Berengar's affection, Count Otto agreed to his nephew's suggestion and hurried his daughter along. Such a conversation was better to be had behind closed doors. "I agree. Come, Adela, let us get settled into our lodgings." Though Adela did not want to leave Berengar's company too soon, she realized Lind deserved some alone time with the man, and thus she nodded before following her father into the castle while the servants brought in their luggage. As for Henrietta, she followed Adela inside and began to chat with her. She still held onto the infant Hans, which Adela was more than happy to spend time with. After all, this was Berengar's son, and as such, she felt some form of connection to the boy, even if he was not her child. Seeing that the two were alone, Lind embraced Berengar before tracing her finger around his well-toned chest. "Now that we have some time to ourselves, what should we do?" Berengar chuckled and petted her head before whispering in her ear, "I know a few things we can do." With that, The couple fled to the bedroom to get reacquainted while Adela and her father settled into the lodgings that they were provided for their duration in Kufstein. Soon enough, Berengar would be marching to war once more, and he wanted to spend as much time with his two women as possible. Chapter 188 Settling in. After Berengar and Lind were properly reacquainted, they redressed themselves and left their chambers, where they proceeded to greet Adela and Otto. Otto was chatting with Liudbert, who was Berengar's chancellor and had traveled to Kufstein, the seat of power in Tyrol, to conduct Berengar's affairs while he was away. Adela was hanging out with Henrietta and Hans, playing with the infant child in his room. Seeing Adela look so affectionately at Hans as if he were her own child brought a smile to Linda's lips. She was frightened over the possibility that Adela would hate her child and try to get rid of him. Yet, instead, she was treating the boy as a member of her own family. Berengar watched as Lind walked over to her little boy and picked him up, and clutched the boy to her mighty bosom. Seeing his two women and his little sister get along so well pleased Berengar, it was an endearing sight to behold. Thus Berengar merely watched the show for some time. After a while, Hans was put to bed, and Berengar brought the girls away from the room so that he could adequately sleep. Adela had a giant smile on her face as she conversed with Lind about her child. Hans is so cute, he has Berengar's eyes and your hair, he is so perfect. Lind smiled at Adela's compliment and hugged Adela tightly as if they were sisters. I bet when you and Berengar have your own son, he will turn out just like his father. Berengar did not want to ruin the moment, but seeing Adela's cheeks flushed with embarrassment from the compliment while nearly suffocating in Linda's mighty cleavage was too funny of a scene. He struggled to prevent himself from laughing at the way the two girls were behaving. Nevertheless, through superior willpower, he maintained his composure and merely smiled endearingly at them. At this moment, Lind noticed something peculiar and grabbed a hold of Adela's chest to confirm her suspicion, which caused the girl's face to flush to a new degree as she broke away from Linda's grasp and covered her growing bust with her arms. Lind had a wicked grin on her face as she openly proclaimed her findings. Adela, you have grown. We should take a bath together and compare sizes. Feeling embarrassed by such a discovery, Adela wanted to hide in a corner. However, with Berengar watching, she refused to back down and thus surprisingly made a bold statement of her own as she proudly displayed her chest to Lind. You just watch, one day, I will be bigger than you. Lind laughed lightly at the young girl's challenge and approached her closely before whispering in her ear. Maybe, but that will take years, and until you grow up, Berengar is all mine. Adela immediately began to pout as she heard Linda's words. She knew exactly what Lind meant and was greatly envious of her. However, she was underaged, and there was nothing she could do about that. All she could do was sulk in defeat. Berengar had seen enough and awkwardly coughed before declaring his next move. You all enjoy yourselves. I'm going to go find Count Otto and see what he is up to. With that, he quickly fled before the girls could keep him. If he had to witness their rowdy actions any longer, he might very well lose his mind. Thus Berengar wandered through the castle until he found Liudbert and Otto in the dining hall sampling the beer Berengar's breweries had produced. Berengar quickly sat down at the head of the table and ordered one of the nearby servants. Fetch me my chalice and a flagon of Doppelbock beer. The servant did not dare disobey the mighty Count of Tyrol and quickly nodded before going off to do as instructed. Liudbert and Otto could tell Berengar was flustered and were instantly interested in what had happened. Ultimately, Otto was the first to ask. So, how are the girls? Berengar sighed deeply before being brutally honest in his reply. They are about to take a bath so that they can compare sizes. Count Otto and Liudbert were already sufficiently intoxicated at this point and gazed at each other before returning their sights to Berengar. Liudbert was the first to speak his mind. Tisk, lucky bastard. Count Otto, on the other hand, immediately broke out into laughter before expressing his thoughts. That daughter of mine, she acts all high and mighty, but in reality, she is on quite good terms with your lover, isn't she? It seems that I have nothing to worry about. Don't worry, Berengar. If she is anything like her sisters, she will grow up to have a body that is equal to that red-haired lass of yours. Berengar was quite shocked that Count Otto was speaking in such a way about his daughter. Then again, he had never witnessed the man drunk before. Clearly, he could not handle his liquor, and for a beer, the Doppelbock that they were drinking was quite strong, with 8% alcohol content. Eventually, The servant arrived with Berengar's skull chalice and a flagon of his favorite wine, which Berengar unhesitantly poured into his goblet before taking a swig. This was the first time Count Otto and Viscount Liudbert witnessed what Berengar had done to Lambert's skull and were quite shocked by the results. Though the chalice was made from the skull of another human being, it was dipped in gold and encrusted in finely cut black garnet. The shaft of the chalice that one used to grip was perfectly embedded in the bottom of the skull, as if the entire piece was carved out of one solid block of gold. They hardly believed such barbarity could be so sophisticated. As Berengar drank from the skull chalice, he noticed the looks he was given, and Count Otto was the first to voice his thoughts aloud. "Is that, you know?" Berengar nodded his head silently with an indifferent expression on his face. After he did so, Liudbert was the next one to speak. "Does your family know?" Berengar shook his head in response before gulping down the remainder of the contents in his beer. He quickly poured more into his chalice before responding. "As far as they're aware, that little bastard is still alive and fighting the Golden Horde. I have been meaning to fabricate a letter from the Teutonic Order informing them of his glorious death. I would rather spare my family the pain of knowing that cunt came back to Kufstein in an attempt to kill us all." Count Otto nodded his head in approval. If he were in a similar situation, he would probably lie to his family to spare their feelings as well. After all, the revelation of Lambert's initial actions sent Siegfried into a state of acute depression, so much so that he left Berengar in charge of the realm until the old Viscount finally surrendered his position. He could only imagine the pain his brother-in-law would go through, knowing that his son returned with an army for revenge. After thinking it through, the older count decided to change the subject to something less grim and instead asked about the upcoming plans. "So when will Conrad arrive?" Berengar pondered about it for a moment before giving a rough estimate he had received. "It could be as early as tomorrow, but it could also be at the latest in 3 days. It honestly depends on how many stops the trade caravan he is hiding in makes before they arrive in Kufstein." Count Otto nodded and looked at the dark beer that filled his goblet before nodding in approval. "Good, I would not mind a few more days of drinking such a hearty beer. How did you come up with this?" Berengar chuckled. He too was fond of the beer they were currently drinking, and as such, he gave the count some optimistic news. "I can give you the recipe for it, but it can take up to a year before such a beer is ready to drink." Count Otto's eyes instantly shined when he heard the news, and he nearly pounced at Berengar before calming himself down and reseating himself. "Name your price." Unexpectedly, Berengar merely shook his head in response and gave the man the best news he had heard in weeks. "Consider it a gift. Just make sure to treat me to some of the finished product the next time I find myself in your territory." Count Otto gave Berengar a thumbs up with a giant smile on his face. "Deal." Liudbert, on the other hand, was already in the process of brewing his own batch of the tasty beer. After all, Berengar had already begun to export his cuisine and brewery recipes across the entirety of Tyrol. As such, he did not need the recipe, he merely smiled at Otto. Luckily, this man was Berengar's relative and could thus acquire some benefits such as this for free. Thus Berengar and the other 2 men spent the remainder of their night drinking and talking about important matters of the realm. Meanwhile, Adela and Lind were currently in the bath, negotiating how best to divide Berengar's attention. All the while, Conrad inched close to Kufstein, and when he finally arrived, Berengar would quickly find himself forced into the throes of war once more. After all, peace was never eternal. Chapter 189 Bombard. While Berengar and the others were settling into Kufstein after their long journey, Eckhard was busy acting as the commander of the border forces stationed at Kitzbühel. He had been overseeing the defense of the northeastern borders of Tyrol since he was first deployed to the region. Unlike the Northwest Front, which had devolved into a stalemate, where the attackers refused to advance, the commander of the Northeast Bavarian army constantly threw men at the walls of the Star Fortress. However, no matter what they attempted to do, it ultimately met in failure. At the moment, Eckhard was inside one of the buildings constructed inside the fort that acted as an HQ for the officers who manned its garrison. Currently, Eckhard was conversing with the officers under his command about the constant threat outside their border. A well-armored officer dressed in a 3/4 plate was the first to speak up about the current situation. "If they keep attacking at such a pace, we will eventually run out of munitions. The next resupply from Kufstein is still a week out. Someone needs to inform Berengar that we are running out of munitions and to expedite the delivery. By now, Thousands of bodies lie riddled with bullets and shrapnel outside the fort, rotting in the area strictly labeled by the enemy army as the kill zone. Anything that entered the area would be battered by musket fire and artillery barrages. It was indeed a nightmare to get past. Eckhard nodded his head in agreement as he took a sip from his mug, which was filled with beer. If there was one thing Berengar had made sure while he was recovering from his injury and attending to matters of the state, it was that his troops were well supplied with high-quality rations. It was only after the grizzled veteran had quenched his parched throat with the delectable taste of Oktoberfest beer that he began to speak his piece. "We will send a carrier pigeon to Kufstein to ensure that the shipment of our munitions and other supplies will be expedited. As for the situation at the border itself, how are we doing?" Another officer, who was roughly the same age as Eckhard and had been a knight of Kufstein for many years, quickly began his account of the ongoing efforts to defend the border. A patrol recently caught a unit of men at arms no greater than 250 trying to cross through the mountains and into Kufstein. They were most likely tasked with sabotage. However, they were effectively gunned down by our patrols before they could do any damage. As for the walls themselves, they are holding. The enemy cannot harm our fortress, at least not at the moment. New novel chapters are published on lightnovelpub.com. Eckhard nodded in silence. Aside from running low on supplies, there was not much to worry about when it came to the defense of the northeast border of Tyrol. However, for whatever reason, Eckhard felt a nagging suspicion in the back of his mind that the Bavarians were going to try something drastic. Thus he gave his officers an order before concluding the meeting. "Double the nightly watch and the ongoing patrols. I do not want any Bavarians slipping past our border." The officers all saluted Eckhard by pounding their steel breastplates with their fists before answering in the affirmative. "Yes, sir." With that, Eckhard turned his back on them and gave one final order for the night. Dismissed. Hearing their orders, the men finally departed from the fort's HQ and were set upon their tasks. As for Eckhard, he stared at the map in front of him and pondered about the actions that the Bavarians might take. The number of men they threw at his wall was unbelievable. Despite setback after setback, they still attacked at regular intervals. They were doing this in an attempt to lower his guard, but he did not know what for. Ultimately Eckhard sighed before he decided to give up on predicting the enemy's plan. He would never be able to guess what devious plot the Bavarians were up to. He would do best to adapt when such a scheme reared its ugly head. As such, he left the HQ and entered his quarters, where he climbed into his cot and slept peacefully for the night. Updated from lightnovelpub.com. Hours had passed, and it was roughly midnight. The new moon in the sky provided excellent cover for the Bavarians' latest plot to break through the mighty Star Fortress. Since they could not pierce through its defenses during the day, they had been wasting men's lives over the past few weeks at regular intervals to lower the guard of their opponent. Now the time had come for them to unleash the plot that they had long since planned for. Under the cover of darkness, Bavarian soldiers slowly moved the horses into position, keeping the creatures calm to the best of their ability. The carts the horses dragged behind them carried large, iron tubes, which resembled primitive cannons. However, unlike the 12 and 24 pounds artillery that Berengar's forces used, these massive cannons fired large stone balls that were bigger than most men's torsos. Slowly but surely, the devices known as bombards made their way into firing position where they were set up, entirely shrouded by the lack of illumination which this particular night provided. During the loading process, one of the large stone balls fell from the cannon's mouth and crashed on the ground, creating a loud thud. One of the soldiers instantly scolded the man who had screwed up the loading procedure in a hushed tone. "Fool, you are going to alert the Tyroleans." However, after several seconds, it became apparent that the guards on the walls nearby did not notice the commotion. As such, the men sighed before restarting the loading procedure. In total, there were 3 of these monumental devices. It was all that Duke Dietger could afford. He had not even brought such masterpieces to Vienna. Yet here at the borders of Tyrol against a small star fortress, the Bavarians were forced to unleash their mightiest weapon. Eventually, the cannons were lit, and after several seconds a loud thunderous noise echoed in the air before the massive stone cannonballs found their way into the fortress walls. The Bavarian army began to cheer outside the walls as they believed such a small bombardment was fully capable of dealing significant damage to the Tyrolean walls. However, when the dust settled, All that such a thing managed to accomplish was alert the Tyrolean defenders, who rapidly climbed to their positions where they began to load their 24-pound siege cannons and aim them at the bombards. When the Bavarian commander gazed at the wall sections only to realize that they were still mostly intact, his jaw dropped. Follow new episodes on the light novel pub.com platform. The man had no way of knowing that the low and thick walls of a star fortress were explicitly designed to mitigate the destructive power of cannons. Since these walls were made of steel-reinforced concrete bricks, they were far more resilient than anything outside Tyrol. Eckhard quickly rushed out of bed and entered the scene, where he saw his men rapidly loading the 24-pound guns mounted on the walls. When he arrived, they quickly stopped what they were doing and saluted the man before waiting for the field marshal to speak. Eckhard quickly assessed the damage before a wicked grin formed on his face. Show these fools what real artillery bombardment looks like. The Tyrolean defenders quickly responded with a salute and the battle cry they were so well known for. God with us. Afterward, the 24-pound cannons that were mounted in the direction of the bombards were fired, and a dozen of 24-pound explosive shells landed upon the bombards, destroying the devices and shredding the fools who had marched right into the kill zone. However, the battle did not end there, as the cannons were rapidly reloaded and fired once more, this time aimed at the siege camp the Bavarians had foolishly erected within firing range of the mighty artillery that Berengar's forces possessed. Until now, they had been fighting a war of attrition, but Eckhard was fully aware of Berengar's ongoing plans and had decided to wipe out the army who approached the northeastern border on this night. He was thoroughly outraged that the fools would bring cannons against him. As such, he wanted to teach the Bavarians a valuable lesson about who the true master of artillery was. Thus the Tyrolean defenders retaliated and began to bombard the enemy encampment throughout the entirety of the night. Blood-curdling screams filled the air, alongside the sounds of explosions detonating upon the enemy position. As the enemy commander gazed upon the destruction of his encampment, he quickly saw a projectile heading straight for him and cursed under his breath. God damn it! With that, the shell landed on top of him, and the explosive blast engulfed his figure, rendering him into nothing more than mincemeat. The thunderous echoes of a dozen cannons would continue to fire off throughout the night, long after the Bavarian army had been utterly destroyed. Chapter 190 Dreadfully Hungover. During the night that Eckhard had obliterated the Bavarian army tasked with assaulting the northeast border, Berengar had gotten quite intoxicated conversing with Duke Otto and Liudbert, so much so that Adela was currently scowling at her father, blaming him for Berengar's current state. Father, why are you such a poor influence on Berengar? He should not be drinking so much. Berengar was entertained by the fact that he was not scolded for his actions, but his future wife had laid the blame entirely on her father. It just showed that Count Otto must have had a habit of overdrinking. As for Liudbert, he was also being given the scornful look of a displeased young woman by his younger sister. She knew that Berengar was expecting an important guest to arrive, possibly within the next day. Thus, she was displeased by Berengar's actions. However, she held her brother responsible considering he too had drinking problems. Berengar was usually a responsible drinker. He liked the taste of beer and had a high tolerance to alcohol. Thus he was rarely exceptionally drunk, nor was he often hungover. However, the three men were in terrible condition at the moment. While Lind and Adela had an important conversation in the bath, these men had been drinking, and they had consumed no small amount from the way it appeared. Ultimately Lind voiced her concerns as well. Liudbert, as Chancellor, you should know better than to drink to such excess, especially taking into consideration that you roped Berengar into your mess. Berengar was enjoying the sight of the two men getting scolded. However, as Count, he had to protect the reputation of his subordinates. Thus he began to speak. However, the moment he did so, his words started to slur, despite himself not recognizing such a thing. Lin. Della, I'm fine, I can still drink? Seeing that Berengar could no longer complete a proper sentence, Lind simply walked over to him and grabbed a hold of his shoulder, helping him up from his chair. Darling, it is time to get some rest. There is an important guest who might be arriving tomorrow, and you need to be in proper shape. Though Berengar wanted to deny that he was drunk, the moment he stepped up, he began to wobble, and eventually, his legs gave out from under him, causing him to fall over onto Lind, dragging her onto the floor with him. New novel chapters are published on lightnovelpub.com. The way that Berengar had landed was with his face pressed into Linda's substantial bust, which caused quite the scene. The two other drunk men began to cheer for Berengar, with Count Otto being the first to compliment him. "That's my boy." The moment Adela heard her father say such an outrageous thing, she lashed out at him verbally. "Father, don't encourage such uncouth behavior." As for Liudbert, he began pouring another drink as he cheered for Berengar. "Show my sister who is boss." Hearing such words, Lind instantly became furious at her brother and gave him a chilling stare which immediately silenced the man. As for Berengar, he was in no condition to get up and merely nuzzled his head further into Linda's mighty cleavage. He was completely unaware of what he said next. So soft. Lind quickly realized that Berengar was attempting to use her breasts as a pillow and immediately began to blush in embarrassment. "Darling, not in public." Seeing that Lind was starting to become excited from the humiliating display, Adela instantly became sickened by the inappropriate scene in front of her. She quickly stormed over to Berengar's side, where she proceeded to help him up and off of Lind. It was only after both women supported Berengar that he was dragged off and into his quarters. After reaching his room, the two girls helped him onto the bed, where Lind wiped the sweat from her brow. She was not used to such heavy lifting. Follow new episodes on the lightnovelpub.com platform. Thanks, Adela. I will take it from here. Realizing what the young woman was talking about, Adela instantly began to blush and nodded her head. Though she was curious, she knew it was inappropriate for her to stay any further, and thus she quickly fled the scene. It was only after Adela shut the doors behind her that Lind began to lick her lips in excitement. She quickly stripped him of his clothes and then her own before climbing into bed with her lover, where she dragged his face over to her bare chest before stroking his hair lightly. Berengar, who was barely conscious, instantly noticed the softness and once more used Linda's chest as a pillow. Now that they were alone, Lind did not care how Berengar used her body. As such, she clutched her lover to her breast as if she was feeding her child and quickly fell asleep alongside him. Hours passed, and the light of dawn rose in the sky, yet Berengar was still sleeping. It was unusual for him to slumber for such an extended period. However, after drinking to the excessive degree that he had done the night before, he managed to sleep in until noon. When he finally opened his eyes, he saw that he was being held tightly to Linda's chest, who was asleep next to him. Unlike Berengar, Lind could sleep in as long as she desired, even while sober. Since she had no inclination to end this harmonious scene so early, she continued to rest alongside her lover. The beautiful young woman opened her eyes and taunted Berengar after he had finally forced himself out of her cleavage. "You sure had fun last night." Berengar had no recollection of the night before. Instead, his head was pounding as if it was repeatedly slammed with a 4-pound sledge. Thus he struggled to regain his clarity as he listened to Linda's provocation. After concluding the events that transpired the previous night, he ultimately decided to ask the woman. What the hell did I do last night?" Lind merely crossed her arms and sneered at him with pity. Follow current novels on Light Novel Pub. See Ohm. You drank a lot, and then you continued to drink until finally, you could no longer stand. Adela and I had to drag you back to our room. If I had known that by leaving you alone with my idiot brother, and Adela's alcoholic father that you would drink to the point of passing out, I wouldn't have spent so long in the bath with Adela. Berengar's memories were starting to return to him, to the point where he remembered several embarrassing scenes from the night before. Eventually, he got out of his bed and put on his luxurious clothes, where Lind followed suit. The entire time, she had a mocking expression on her face. She could tell by the way he was behaving that he was in severe pain at the moment, and she felt it was well deserved for acting like an idiot. Eventually, Lind had to help Berengar get dressed because despite resting for a solid 12 hours, he still felt dizzy from the amount he had drunk the night prior. After some time, the couple made their way to the dining hall, where Count Otto and Liudbert were sitting with equally miserable expressions. Luckily they too were severely lacking in their mental faculties and could hardly remember how foolish they had acted the night before. Berengar sat down at the table and immediately made a request to the staff who attended to his needs. "Bring me a pitcher of milk." The servant looked at him with an odd expression before confirming. "A whole pitcher? Are you sure you would not like to start with a chalice?" Berengar held his head in the palm of both of his hands as he lightly raked his fingers across his eye and eye patch before confirming his request. "Yes, a whole pitcher, you can forget the damn chalice." The servant was shocked at how Berengar snapped at her. Usually, he was so friendly. He must have had quite the night last night. Berengar seldom got drunk to the point of being hungover, but he turned exceptionally impatient and nasty when such a thing occurred. Thus the servant quickly went to the kitchen to fetch a milk pitcher before returning and handing it to Berengar, where she proceeded to inquire about her next task. "Does your excellency require anything further?" Berengar did not even need to think about it and quickly gave his response. Follow new episodes on the light novel Pub. See Ohm platform. Toast, over easy eggs, and a side of bacon. Make it quick. The servant quickly nodded before running off to the kitchen to inform them of Berengar's request. Berengar's hangover cure usually consisted of coffee with milk in it, toast, and eggs, and some form of meat. However, at the moment, he did not have access to coffee. It would be some time before such a thing naturally made its way into Europe. At the moment, he greatly desired to sail an expedition around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Horn of Africa, where he could colonize Ethiopia so he could seize their massive coffee forests for himself. As for the rest of the people present at the table, they were either as miserable as he was, or they were gloating at the foolishness of men. Regardless, Berengar had important matters to attend to on this day, and he desperately needed to shape up before Conrad's potential arrival. Chapter 191: Conrad's Arrival. The trade caravan that Elma, Conrad, and the other agent were hiding within finally pulled up to the city walls of Kufstein. Conrad gazed out from the back of the wagon and onto the magnificent city walls. Though they were not as tall as conventional castle walls, they were far thicker and designed in a way that he had never seen before. Despite the glory of Kufstein's mighty city walls, Conrad was by no means an architect or even knowledgeable in tactics. Thus, the boy did not have an overwhelming sense of inspiration for their brilliant design. Instead, he looked mockingly at the short walls, believing they would be easy to scale over with ladders. Of course, this was not the case, as the wide moat surrounding the walls, making it nearly impossible to do so while exposing any would-be attackers to fire from every angle. Despite this reality, Conrad was blissfully unaware of such a thing, and as such, looked at Berengar's mighty city walls with contempt. However, one of the merchants traveling with the caravan quickly exclaimed upon seeing the walls. "Boy, you should do well to remember that these walls are mightier than they appear. In all of my life, I have never seen nor heard of such a large army repelled so quickly by the defenders." He had been present in Kufstein during Theodoric's invasion. The sight of what remained of the man's army would never leave his memories, and as such, he had decided to voice his thoughts on the matter after noticing the expression on Conrad's face. Conrad was unaware of what had happened during the war for Tyrol, and as such, was utterly ignorant of the fate of the late Viscount Theodoric. Instead, he merely thought the ordinary merchant was exaggerating. Thus he dismissed the man's claims completely. After arriving at the gates, the city's garrison inspected every caravan to see if they carried dangerous materials or enemy agents. After getting to the wagon, which contained Conrad, Elma handed a document to the city guards, where they immediately waved them through. Much to the surprise of the rest of the caravan, who was stuck in the process of being vetted. Conrad was not surprised as he knew that Elma worked for Berengar and must have had some means to enter the city directly. However, when he finally entered the city walls and got to the habited region, the boy became astonished by what he saw. For more, visit light novel Pub. See Ohm. The sprawling tenements, the large chateaux, the construction of the grand projects, all of these things were a sight which Conrad had not expected upon entering the city, which was not much more than a typical town but a year ago. After taking in the sights, Conrad was eventually led to the castle where Berniger currently resided. As he stepped off the wagon, he was immediately greeted by Berengar, Count Otto, and Count Oediger of Vorarlberg, who had arrived in Kufstein not long before Conrad himself. These three men were the leaders of the few counties which remained completely unoccupied by the Bavarians. Upon stepping off the wagon, Berengar instantly greeted Conrad with a degree of respect that the boy had previously not been afforded. "Your Grace, I apologize for the accommodations you suffered through as you traveled to my lands, but I hope you can understand the need for secrecy." Considering Conrad was the last remaining heir of the late Duke Wilmar, Berengar had to at the very least put on a facade of respect, especially if he wanted to win Conrad over to his side, and appoint him the regent. Though Conrad was upset due to the conditions he had found himself in the last few days, he was just thankful to be alive. Thus he dusted himself off before approaching Berengar and the other counts while making demands. I need to bathe and bring me a change of clothes while you are at it, something befitting a man of my position. We will talk after I have made myself presentable. Berengar smiled and nodded before allowing the boy access to his castle. He struggled to contain his laughter when the 12-year-old child proclaimed himself a man. Luckily Berengar had a solid poker face and merely acquiesced to the boy's demands. Of course, Your Grace, you will find my accommodations most fitting. Follow new episodes on the lightnovelpub.com platform. Thus Conrad was led to the bath where he cleaned himself from the filth accumulated on his body over the last few days before changing into a luxurious set of attire fit for a duke that Berengar had long since prepared for Conrad from his textile factories. After doing so, they met up in the dining room, where Berengar brought out his finest cuisine to treat the boy. Lind, Adela, and Henrietta were not present for the meeting at the dining table. Aside from the 3 counts, only Liebert was present as Chancellor of Tyrol. As the group dined on their lunch, Otto began to voice his concerns to Conrad. Your Grace, I assume you are aware that the Bavarians have captured Vienna, your brothers have all been executed, and your sisters have been taken away by Dietger to be married off to his sons. You are the last remaining heir of your father. This means you are now officially the Duke of Austria and potentially the last remaining heir to the Kingdom of Germany, considering your late mother was the king's only daughter. Conrad was too busy stuffing his face with the delicious meal presented to him as if he had not eaten in days, which was far from the case. However, all he managed to eat was bread and beer during his travels, and as such, he was glad to have some meat in front of him finally. Even though the boy had not answered Count Otto, the man did not hesitate to continue his train of thought. Considering you are still underage, you will require a regent to act on your behalf, and I recommend Count Berengar for the position. He has proven to be an exceptional battlefield commander and efficient statesman. With him aiding you with your responsibilities, we will be sure to recover the land stolen from us by those dastardly Bavarians. Hearing this, Conrad immediately looked up from his plate and stared at the lords in front of him for a few moments before a devious plot formed in his head. Now that he was duke, he could make any demands he wanted. Thus he quickly set forth his conditions. You are saying I am duke now, is that correct? Count Otto nodded his head silently in agreement. Thus a wicked grin curved upon Conrad's lips as he stated his demands. Good. If that is the case, you will break Adela's betrothal to Berengar and engage her to me. It would be best for a woman like Adela to marry someone of my prestige instead of a lowly count like Berengar. This content is taken from lightnovelpub.com. Hearing this ludicrous ultimatum, Otto clenched his fists and teeth in rage. Noticing how he was appearing, Berengar patted the man on his shoulder in comfort. However, what followed surprised everyone present for the meeting. Rather than being visibly outraged, Berengar put a pleasant smile on his face and began to negotiate with the small boy, despite being the true power within the room. Conrad, it is best to give up on your obsession with my fiancé and find someone more suited for your position. You are now the Duke of Austria, and if you decide to press your claim, potentially one day you could be the King of Germany. You should marry a princess, not a lowly countess as you have previously referred to the status that Adela has. Conrad was shocked when he heard this. It is true that he greatly desired Adela to be his bride, but what Berengar said had resonated with him. He was now a duke and potentially one day could be a king. He really should marry a princess of another kingdom, and allow Adela and Berengar to remain in their lowly position. Besides, even if Berengar did become his regent, one day he would be old enough to need one no longer, and at that moment, he could use his authority to force Berengar to give his wife to him for entertainment. Or so Conrad thought. In reality, Berengar had plans to get rid of the boy before that day could ever become a reality. However, Conrad did not know this, and with these thoughts in his head, he instantly agreed to Berengar's suggestion. Very well, I will do as you suggest. You can forget about my earlier request. As for my regent, I suppose Berengar has shown that he can fulfill such a position. Thus I will consider it as an option for the time being. I will announce who I have decided to be my regent after getting accustomed to the current situation that has occurred in my lands. While Conrad presented such an amicable tone, in his mind, he was secretly thinking to himself. Even if I am compelled to make you my regent, one day your fiancé will be mine. You just wait, Berengar. I will show you who is truly worthy of being with such a woman. Berengar could easily guess what the foolish boy was thinking, and while Conrad was scheming in his head to steal Adela from him, Berengar was thinking in his mind. Fat chance, kiddo, you will be dead before you even turn 16. Enjoy your few years left as my puppet. For more, visit Light Novel Pub. See Ohm. As such, the two noblemen plotted against one another, all while smiling as if they were the greatest of friends and allies. The sight of which sent chills down the spines of the other three noblemen who were present, who could easily guess what both Berengar and Conrad were thinking behind their friendly facades. Chapter 192 Conrad's Ambitions. With Conrad in Kufstein, Berengar felt assured that his rise to power was secure. Thus he spent the remainder of his day visiting Ludwig's office. The man was currently busy overseeing production. It had been a while since Berengar last popped by to say hello, and there was a particular reason for him to do so this time. Berengar had devised a much smaller, flintlock revolver based on the old pepperbox revolvers. The previous pattern was too large to be kept well hidden by his agents across enemy lands, and he had wanted to fix that issue. Thus he stopped by Ludwig's office unannounced. Berengar quickly knocked on the door, and a few seconds passed before Ludwig opened it. Seeing his old friend for the first time in a long time, a broad smile appeared on Ludwig's face before he immediately realized that Berengar had a set of blueprints in his hands. "Oh, of course, Your Excellency is here to give me more work. You couldn't bother to stop by for a drink every once in a while like the old days, huh?" Berengar chuckled at Ludwig's response before forcing his way into the room and laying out his blueprints for the old craftsman to witness. As he did so, he responded to the older man's jest. "I am afraid with 2 women and a county to run, I do not have much time to visit you. I'm sorry, my old friend." Ludwig immediately thought about Berengar's current lifestyle and understood his pain. Thus he pulled out a pair of mugs sitting in the corner of the room before filling them with beer. He handed one to Berengar while taking a sip of the malty liquid himself before getting down to business. "What is it you have brought me this time?" Berengar pointed at the design before him and said with a prideful smile on his face. "I call it the pepperbox revolver. The old revolving flintlocks which my agents use are much too large to be properly concealed. Thus I thought of these weapons for use. Granted, their range is inferior to the other models, but as a personal defense weapon, they are more than enough firepower." Ludwig took a glance at the blueprints before nodding in approval. "As always, you do not disappoint with your designs." The two men took a few gulps from their beers before discussing more matters of business. Berengar was the first to ask about his production capabilities. "The source of this content is lightnovelpub.com. So, how is production going?" Ludwig looked at Berengar as if he were an idiot. That question was broad to say the least and had many answers he could potentially say. As such, he asked for clarification. "Your Excellency, which production line are you talking about in particular?" Berengar smiled before finishing off the beer in his mug. He only began to answer after Ludwig had refilled it. "The Byzantine armor." Hearing what Berengar was asking about, Ludwig scratched his beard slightly before answering to his best ability. "It is going as planned. Luckily the new industrial district in Innsbruck is operating at full capacity, so they have been able to alleviate the pressure on our shoulders. As per usual, the Byzantine armor will be readily available when the time for shipment has arrived." "Why are you planning a visit to the Empire?" After hearing Ludwig's question, Berengar was shocked. He indeed planned to visit the Empire, but only after he had won his war and made himself duke. He was still a long way away from achieving such things. Thus merely shook his head as he responded to Ludwig's inquiry. "Not at the moment. If I am to travel to the Empire, I need more prestige, or else they will try to walk all over me. One day though, I would like to see the city of Constantinople for myself." Ludwig nodded his head in agreement. He too longed to see the legendary city for himself. However, he did not have the gall to ask Berengar to take him along for the journey when he finally went. Thus he merely toasted Berengar with his mug. "To your future success, may those imperial bastards bow before your prestige." Hearing such a bold toast, Berengar merely chuckled before drinking the remainder of the contents in his mug. Afterward, he began to ask Ludwig about various questions. The two men talked for some time before Berengar bade farewell and returned to the castle. After entering the castle, he was immediately notified by one of his servants that Conrad had called for a meeting in his study, and thus Berengar quickly strode towards it. When he opened the door, he saw the little brat sitting in his chair, surrounded by the other counts, who gazed at him with worried expressions on their faces. The most up-to-date novels are published on lightnovelpub.com. Berengar's face twitched when he saw the boy in his chair. This was Berengar's personal study, and the brat treated it as if it had belonged to him. However, for now, Berengar had to suppress his ire and put on a respectful facade. As such, he bowed gracefully before greeting Conrad. "Your Grace, I came as soon as I heard. What is so important that you must call a meeting at such an hour?" Conrad had a smirk on his face as he began to interrogate Berengar about his plans for reconquest. "Count Berengar, exactly how long will it take you to raise an army to recapture my lands?" Berengar could tell this little brat was trying to push him into the war ahead of schedule. Clearly, the boy was impatient and did not want to sit around in Kufstein for long. However, Berengar had no plans to march until his armies were powerful enough to sweep through the Bavarian forces, and as such, he merely smiled before giving the number he had in mind. 3 more months and a sufficient number of men should be finished with their training. By then, we can march on Salzburg, where we will liberate it from the Bavarians. The plan from there is to seize the county of Kärnten before marching on Upper and Lower Austria. A frown immediately appeared on Conrad's face as he heard these words. He did not desire to stay in Kufstein for 3 whole months doing nothing but waiting for troops to be raised. As such, he asked the question on his mind. "How many men do you have available at the moment?" Berengar struggled to maintain his respectful facade as he answered the boy's inquiry. "Aside from the men necessary to maintain the garrisons in Tyrol, I can field at most 20,000 men at the moment." Before Berengar could protest what he knew that Conrad was thinking, the boy interrupted him by asking Count Otto the same question. "How many men do you have available at the moment, Count Otto?" Count Otto frowned while being asked such a question. However, he eventually answered. Updated from Light Novel Pub. C. Roughly half that amount. Berengar not only had one of the largest counties in all of Austria, primarily after he conquered Trent and incorporated it into his lands, but also due to his growing mechanized agriculture, he could field significantly more troops than others of the same level of status. As for the Count of Vorarlberg had the lowest number of troops, as his county was much smaller than the regions held by the other 2 men. Conrad quickly asked the same question, to which he responded, "I can spare at most 5,000 men." Conrad then looked at Berengar with an impatient expression on his face as he began to question Berengar's determination. "You are telling me, a seasoned and heralded commander like yourself will be incapable of taking Austria with 35,000 men? Maybe I need to name a more experienced battlefield commander, like Count Otto, as my regent after all." Hearing this, Berengar began to frown. This boy was starting to push his limits. Nevertheless, he kept his wits about him and thoroughly lectured the boy who would be duke about the reality of warfare. "Your Grace, it is a possibility to win with such a small amount of troops. However, the Bavarians will be back with a vengeance, and we will have suffered substantial losses. In my honest opinion, we should wait 3 months for my next division to be properly trained and outfitted before we begin our campaign. With 45,000 to 50,000 men in total, we will stand a much better chance of winning this war with minimal casualties. I urge you to be patient. Wars are not won overnight." The other counts quickly nodded in agreement to Berengar's terms and attempted to convince the boy to listen to reason. Otto was the first to speak on Berengar's behalf. "Your Grace, listen to Berengar's counsel. He knows what he is talking about." After hearing Berengar's reasoning and Otto's support, Conrad knew he was not going to get his wish, and as such, exhaled deeply in disappointment before accepting the terms. 3 months, not a moment longer. As soon as your troops are ready, I want them deployed." Berengar smiled and nodded as he finally convinced Conrad to go with his plan. Conrad's following words brought an even greater smile to the young count's lips. "With this understanding, I hereby name you Berengar, Count of Tyrol, as my regent, until the day I come of age." Follow new episodes on the lightnovelpub.com platform. With this, Berengar had finally gotten what he wished for, and Conrad had unwittingly sealed his fate. It would not be long before Berengar and his armies marched to war, and when they did, the Bavarians would learn firsthand the might of steel and shot. Chapter 193. You will be home before the leaves fall from the trees. 3 months passed as quickly as they came, and Berengar was ready to march to war. During this time, Adela returned to Steiermark with her father, where Otto defended his borders. Albeit the two counts came to an agreement and Berengar began to support Otto with food aid at a discounted price. After all, Otto's people were suffering from the constant raids on their lands, and Berengar could alleviate that suffering for a fee. It had been over a year since Berengar was first reincarnated into this world, and he had already accomplished a great deal during this time. As for what Berengar was currently occupied with, at the moment, he was once more outfitted for war, standing before Lind, who was holding on to their infant child. The baby boy was growing by the day. Henrietta was also gathered to send her brother off to war. During this time, Berengar had become accustomed to losing his vision in his dominant eye and was now ready to fight once more, albeit he would no longer be the commander once he was brazenly fighting on the front lines. However, at least he would still be on the battlefield commanding his troops. Lind had a worried expression on her face. The last time Berengar had left for war, he had lost an eye and nearly his life. Now he was going to face such danger again. It greatly pained her to see her lover risk his life on the battlefield. As such, she kissed Berengar passionately before muttering under her breath, "I will pray for you." Berengar chuckled at this remark. Lind was never an exceptionally religious woman, but for him, she was willing to pray to God for his safe return. He found this to be cute. As for Henrietta, she hugged her big brother before making him promise her a solemn vow. "Come back in one piece this time." Berengar laughed at the girl's sheepish expression before he tousled her silky golden hair. After doing so, he agreed to her conditions. "I promise, I will be back safe and sound." After saying such a thing, he departed from his home. It had been too long since he had smelled the gunpowder in the air, and now he was eager to face the enemy who had dared to intrude upon his lands. As for Conrad, he had stayed behind in Kufstein, ever under the watchful eye of Lind and Berengar's houseguard. With Berengar's departure, Conrad would be guarded closely to make sure he didn't try anything malicious. Berengar mounted his new steed. The brave beast was opposite in appearance of his old horse Erwin, as its coat and mane were entirely white. Though this mighty destrier had been purchased at a great sum, Berengar still profoundly lamented the loss of his old warhorse and vowed never again to make such a costly mistake. After mounting the bold white stallion, which was clad in its own set of blackened steel-plate barding, with magnificent brass trimming, Berengar rode off out of the castle and regrouped with his army in the streets. This was the last of his forces to rendezvous with Eckhard and the rest of his army in Kitzbühel. Once the army was on the march, it would split into two, with the more significant portion of the military staying with Berengar as he marched on Salzburg. As for the smaller portion, they would regroup with Count Otto's forces in Steiermark before marching on Kärnten. Berengar sat at the head of the army, with his burgonet over his head, marching amid summer. He began to hum along to the marching song that the military behind him was singing. After a few hours, the army reached the eastern border of Kitzbühel, where they proceeded to get settled into the tents surrounding the border fortress. Berengar quickly got off his mount and approached Eckhard, who had long since defended the northeast border from the invading Bavarians. Still, he was left in control of the region to ensure no other army came to attack. Seeing his lord and commander approach him, Eckhard quickly pounded his chest in a salute before addressing his old friend, that he had not seen for some time. "Your Excellency." Berengar chuckled when he saw Eckhard being serious and slapped the man's backplate with his leather-covered palm. "It is good to see you, Eckhard. It has been quite a while." Eckhard smiled, seeing that Berengar was back to his old self, even after such a grievous injury. Thus he responded to Berengar's informal approach in an equally laid-back manner. "It is just a damn shame we will be leaving each other's company so shortly after reuniting." A wide grin spread across Berengar's face as he looked off into the distance with his good eye. He was gazing towards the direction of Vienna. By reconquering the capital of the duchy he would soon establish himself and his dynasty as the main power of Austria. "Worry not, Eckhard, if we do our jobs right, this war will end soon enough." After reuniting with his field marshal, and his other general Arnulf, Berengar had opted to gather his high-ranking officers on a hill in front of the border fort that his army was occupying. There was not enough space for the total amount of his troops to stay within the fort's walls, so many of them were gathered in tents outside of the fortress. As the high-ranking officers gathered around Berengar, he quickly addressed them, as he tried to encourage them with a speech fit for the situation. "It has been a while since we last marched to war, and though many of you have been defending our borders, others have been enjoying the stability that we have brought to our lands. However, as you all know, the price of freedom is paid with the blood and bodies of those willing to defend it. Suppose we wish to continue our existence as the overlords of our region without interference from a foreign power. In that case, we must fight, not for ourselves or our families but all of Austria. For though we are all Tyroleans, we are, more importantly, Austrians. Our brothers and sisters in the other regions have bled and starved while we have hidden behind our borders allowing it to happen. Now our actions were not without good reason, as we needed time to build up an army large and powerful enough to defeat the enemy, or else we would end up just like our neighbors. Yet that does not forgive the fact that we have chosen to hide in our well-fortified mountainous terrain. Yet no longer, tomorrow we march to war to liberate Austria from the occupation of our enemies. The Bavarians seek to press claim over us all and rule us under their rules and their customs. I reject it, for Austria shall forever remain in the hands of the Austrians. I promise you, if you all do your part in this upcoming conflict you will be home before the leaves fall from the trees. God with us. Right before Berengar had finished the last part of his speech, he drew his sword and pointed it northward into the night sky before shouting the battle cry that his armies had become renowned for. The moment he did so, the officers who had gathered to witness his word all withdrew their swords and pointed them into the sky before also screaming the Tyrolean battle cry. God with us. After chanting those words a few more times, Berengar finally silenced the crowd and addressed his officers. Now, go rest, for tomorrow we march to war. After hearing Berengar's orders, the high-ranking officers all began to head towards their quarters, where they all rested for the night. Berengar, on the other hand, had a private drink with Eckhard. He would finally reveal his schemes to become Duke to his most trusted general. Eckhard knew something was suspicious from the start. After hearing that Conrad was saved by Berengar and brought to Kufstein for safety, he knew Berengar was plotting something serious, though he did not know what. Berengar brought 2 mugs of beer over to the table where Eckhard was sitting before he sat down. After doing so, he handed a mug to Eckhard and began to drink from his own. It was only after the two had tasted the beer that Berengar began to address Eckhard with a grave expression. I will be Duke of Austria soon enough. Eckhard merely laughed as he heard these words. Berengar's ambitions were never satisfied. As such, he began to ask Berengar what his plan was. How do you plan to do that? Last I checked, Conrad was the Duke. Berengar was utterly frank with Eckhard, and as such, he told the truth. After I have won that boy's wars for him, I will continue to be his regent. During this time, he will be slowly poisoned until the point of severe illness. It may be years, but before that boy turns 16, he will croak, leaving me as regent in a position to sweep in and usurp his title. Eckhard gazed at Berengar with a shocked expression on his face, before leaning in and whispering to him, "You are going to poison a child?" Berengar merely took a drink from his mug before answering Eckhard's question. It is either that or I will be forced to start a civil war. Eckhard looked at Berengar with a sense of disdain before asking Berengar another question. You want to be Duke so badly that you would kill an innocent child? Berengar shook his head and looked sternly at Eckhard before he began to lecture him. The boy covets my fiancée. The moment he gains any real authority by becoming a duke, he will demand I hand her over to him. By that point, Adela will be my wife, and I will refuse to do so. He will try to have me killed for resisting his orders, and I will raise an army to fight him. Eckhard could not believe Berengar was willing to throw the duchy into another chaotic war all for a woman. As such, he tried to reason with Berengar. Since this was the justification Berengar had used for his actions, Eckhard would be sure to offer an alternative solution. You could just give the girl over to the boy. After all, you already have Lind. Just marry her and legitimize your child. Berengar shook his head while taking another sip. After doing so, Eckhard grew furious and pounded his fist on the table before screaming at Berengar. Give me one good reason not to. Berengar glared at the man fiercely before answering him. Because I love her. Hearing this, Eckhard scoffed. Seeing that the man was displeased with his plans, Berengar decided to pose a philosophical question. Eckhard, with all your infinite wisdom, explain to me why it is more righteous to have thousands of men die on the battlefield than it is to poison a single child? With those words, Eckhard stared at Berengar with disbelief. He honestly did not know how to answer that question. Berengar decided to add salt to the wound as he further pressed Eckhard. He pointed to the door while doing so. Why do the lives of those men not matter as much as Conrad's? Whether it is to secure Adela's hand in marriage or fulfill my great ambitions, it truly does not matter. If I can spare the life of a single one of my soldiers by poisoning Conrad, then I will do it. You would do best to remember where your loyalties lie. It is not just to me, but the men, women, and children beneath my rule, and if I can spare them the pain of war by engaging in a bit of evil, then I will gladly do so. Eckhard drained the mug of beer down his gullet before pouring another one, where he proceeded to consume its contents rapidly. It was only after he had chugged 3 beers and wiped the foam from his beard that he decided to say his final thoughts on the matter. You are right, I am sorry, I find it a bit cruel to poison a child, but you are right, as always. Even if you were willing to give up on Adela, put aside your ambitions, by allowing Conrad to be duke, that would only bring disaster to our lands. That boy is not fit to rule our people, but you are. Hearing Eckhard finally agreed to his plans, Berengar smiled and patted him on the back. Go get some rest, old friend, we will be marching to war at dawn. With that said, Eckhard smiled before departing, leaving Berengar by his lonesome. It was only after Eckhard was long gone that Berengar began to think about the actions he would have to take before reaching the heights of his ambition. In doing so, his lips turned into a sinister smile before voicing his thoughts aloud. For the path that I walk upon, poisoning a child is but a drop in the well. Oh, my dear friend Eckhard, I am destined to do far worse in the future. Yet, in the end, by doing so, I shall establish global hegemony for my dynasty. Chapter 194 Lightning War. The following day Berengar and his armies packed up their supplies and began to march, an army of 30,000 men, comprised of 3 divisions of 10,000 men each, was fielded to fight this campaign that Berengar had decided to name the Lightning War. The divisions were split into 4 brigades in total, 2 infantry, 1 cavalry, and 1 artillery. The artillery brigades contained roughly 3,000 to 4,000 men in total and up to 70 field guns in each. The amount of explosive firepower that a single artillery brigade wielded was in itself enough to bring down any armed force that dared to get in its path, especially when complemented by the infantry brigades. As for the infantry brigades, they held 3,000 to 5,000 men in each brigade, and these units consisted of various units, ranging from line infantry, grenadier, Jaegers, and even light infantry. Obviously, there were other units within, like medics and sappers. It was a well-oiled machine designed with a single purpose: absolute annihilation of the enemy. The cavalry brigades, on the other hand, were much smaller in size. They were filled with 2,000 men and their horses per brigade. As for the units within these brigades, there were also split into different groups, such as cuirassiers, demi-lancers, and hussars. There were also units of dragoons and mounted infantry, but they were smaller in number, as their purpose was more specialized. The expense that Berengar had to pay to not only train these troops but maintain them was significant. If one counted the sheer cost he paid to acquire the horses to ride, it was enough to bankrupt most counties in the European world. However, Berengar was very wealthy after the monumental success of his diverse economy and could afford to bear such an expense. This massive force was followed by the medieval army of the county of Vorarlberg, who were all completely shocked by the size of Berengar's army, and the equipment they used. There was likely no other army in the world as grand as his. They felt inadequate when they gazed upon the blackened steel plate and extravagant clothing beneath it that the Tyrolean forces wielded. The plan was for 2 divisions to follow Berengar to Salzburg, where he would meet the Bavarians in the field and retake the castles and cities they had seized. With such a large force that contained an absurd degree of firepower, Berengar could easily swamp the entire county within a matter of weeks, at most a month. The other army would be led by Eckhard and Count Oediger and would consist of one of Berengar's divisions, supported by the 5,000 men of Oediger's military. They would attack the county of Kärnten, where Count Otto and his 10,000 men would reinforce them. They would launch an attack from both sides of the county and meet in the middle after dispelling the Bavarians from the region. After both regions were secured, Berengar would march his army on Lower Austria and Vienna, and Eckhard and his allies would march on Upper Austria. From there, any Bavarians who remained in the other counties would be quickly defeated, thus restoring Austrian control over their territory. This was the invasion plan, and Berengar felt he had enough men and firepower to complete it. Thus he met up with Eckhard and Oediger at a crossroads which would take them in a separate direction. The three men sat on horseback as Berengar said his farewells. "The next time I see the two of you, I will have taken Vienna. I look forward to the day we can all meet again." Eckhard nodded at Berengar before saluting one last time. "Your Excellency, I will do as you have instructed to the best of my abilities." Berengar nodded with a smile on his face before responding to Eckhard's claims. "I am sure that you will not disappoint me. Until we meet again, Esser Eckhard, Count Oediger." After saying such a thing, Berengar and Eckhard's forces separated, where Berengar slowly made his way to the county of Salzburg. By the time he arrived in the region, he had noticed that the villages that he passed by had all been looted, many of them were abandoned entirely. The devastation brought to the Austrian lands was horrifying. Bodies of men, women, and children were hewn about, and many of the women had appeared to have been thoroughly used by the men of the Bavarian armies before their deaths. Berengar and his army eventually made their way through the border town and towards the first castle on their path, which was supposed to protect the villagers. It was currently undergoing a siege by the Bavarian armies, who had not yet noticed Berengar and his own army's approach. As such, Berengar instantly gave an order to his army: "Get into formation, and ready the cannons to fire. Infantry, prepare your muskets. Cavalry, be on alert." Berengar had 2 divisions under his command. He currently had 140 12-pound field cannons in his ranks which were rapidly put into position and loaded. Before long, tens of thousands of infantry loaded their rifled muskets and formed ranks. By the time they were entirely in formation, the Bavarians had just noticed their approach and began to panic. Such a large army had crossed the Tyrolean border and encountered them during a siege. It was as if they come across a poisonous snake as they were crapping in the woods. They had no idea how to react to the situation before them. Still, seeing the army hundreds of meters away, with over 100 cannons being rapidly loaded, many of the men instantly began praying to God for their salvation. These prayers were cut short as the thundering echo of 140 cannons firing at once filled the air while the shells fell from the sky and pounded the besieging army. The massive ranks of line infantry and grenadier advanced towards their effective range so that they too could batter the enemy, while the Jaegers fired from a distance of roughly 800 meters. Thousands of besieging Bavarians were shredded by the explosive blasts and shrapnel of the cannon fire, only for the survivors to be mercilessly gunned down at a distance by the muskets. This besieging army was not large and held only about 5,000 men in total. It did not take more than a few cannon and musket volleys to mercilessly tear the siege camp and its forces apart instantly. Limbs were scattered across the ground, and blood pooled in the grass as the defenders of the castle gazed on with horror at the scene that had just transpired. Such overwhelming power was inconceivable, and Berengar did not even need to unleash his cavalry. The lord of the castle sat atop his ramparts looking at the simple yet dignified banners of the von Kufstein family and thanked God for his salvation. He was in a crisis, having no idea how he would be able to defend his territory against the besiegers effectively. Yet, in his hour of need, the Tyroleans finally arrived from beyond the border and liberated him and his people from the injustice of the Bavarian occupation of Salzburg. There were still plenty of regions within Salzburg that were holding out, hoping for a savior. The same could be said across all of Austria. Though it had been months since the Bavarians invaded, they could not bring down the enemy's walls as quickly as Berengar could. Thus they were forced to besiege every castle and city slowly. The Bavarian invasion of Austria was a prolonged process that was intended to take months, if not years, to complete. Now that Berengar had arrived with 140 cannons, he would be able to bring down a city's walls within a day. It was an army the likes the world had never seen before, and Berengar had deliberately waited until he had 3 divisions before marching to war because he wanted his campaign to be another overwhelming victory. With the power in his hands, a mere duke would not be capable of defeating him in battle. To counteract Berengar's hundreds of cannons and thousands of infantry equipped with mostly rifled muskets, there would need to be an army 2 to 3 times the size of his own, and only a kingdom could muster such a force. After defeating the besieging army of 5,000 men as easily as cutting through the grass, Berengar did not bother approaching the castle's gates. Many more battles like this needed to be fought, and as such, he quickly gave another order to his troops. Regroup, and prepare to march. After spending a considerable amount of time getting back into marching formation, the army once more began to set out on its destination. They intended to fight their way until they had liberated the capital of Salzburg, which was currently under siege, Wolfgang's brother valiantly defended the region, while the man who is supposed to be the current count of the area hid within his wife's family's estate. As such, Berengar would encounter many minor skirmishes like this on his way to liberate the capital. They all ended just as quickly and in just as brutal of a fashion. Wherever his army marched, they reaped thousands of Bavarians' lives. Any fool who placed themselves in between him and the main Bavarian army in the county of Salzburg would be rapidly gunned down by Berengar's troops. This lightning war, or blitzkrieg as Berengar had dubbed it, named after the German strategy in the early days of World War II from his past life, was highly influential in cutting off the enemy. Not only did Berengar practice this tactic in Salzburg, but Eckhard also similarly commanded his armies in Kärnten. Berengar was not exaggerating in the slightest when he stated in his speech that he and his men would be home before the leaves fell from the trees. Though it was a reference to Kaiser Wilhelm II's speech to his troops before the start of the Great War in his previous life, he entirely meant those words and knew he was fully capable of making them a reality. As such, the war waged on, and Berengar would soon be the power behind the Austrian throne.